Hey fam. This is the fiction world. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. What if Deku was Isekai'd as demon dragon god and collected breeding harem of all fantasy queens? Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1. The god who fell green. The last thing Izuku Midoriya remembered was the sound of brakes that didn't catch. He'd been walking home from the convenience store, the one 3 blocks from his apartment that stayed open until 2 in the morning because the owner, a tired man named Sato, understood that some people only felt like eating at inconvenient hours. Izuku had been one of those people that night. He'd had a bag with instant ramen, a can of coffee, and a small notebook he'd grabbed on impulse because his other 14 notebooks were full. The kid had been maybe 7. Standing in the road chasing a ball that had rolled off the curb, completely oblivious to the truck that had lost its hydraulic brakes on the downhill slope and was coming in fast with its horn screaming. Izuku didn't remember making a decision. He just remembered moving. He remembered the impact. He remembered, strangely, that he'd never written his name in the new notebook. Then nothing. Then everything. The first sensation was heat, but not the burning kind. It was the heat of something vast and alive, coiling through every nerve ending. He had like a second bloodstream waking up for the first time. He opened his eyes and saw sky. Deep, bruised purple, shot through with veins of dark gold, the kind of sky that existed right at the edge of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it was coming or going. He was lying in a crater. Not metaphorically. An actual crater, roughly 40 feet across, with scorched earth radiating out from where he lay in the center. The grass at the edges was still smoldering. Trees at the perimeter, massive, old-growth things that would have taken 3 people to wrap their arms around, had been snapped at the trunks and thrown outward like someone had detonated something at the center. Izuku sat up slowly and looked at his hands. They were his hands. Same scarred knuckles from years of breaking himself against walls and training equipment. Same bitten-down fingernails that he'd never quite broken the habit of. But the skin had a faint quality to it now, something that shifted between dark and luminous depending on how the light caught it, like the surface of deep water at night. He flexed his fingers. The ground cracked beneath him in a perfect radial pattern, just from the pressure of him shifting his weight. "Okay," he said, to no one in particular. His voice was the same. That was grounding. "Okay. So I'm, somewhere." He stood up. That was the second shock, not because it was difficult, but because it was so effortless that his body overshot what he intended and he rose 2 feet off the ground for a moment before setting back down. He stood very still after that, recalibrating, like a man learning to use a limb he'd never had. The air here tasted different. Denser, somehow, with a mineral sharpness underneath it, like lightning and old stone. He turned in a slow circle and took in the landscape. Rolling hills covered in dark violet grass. In the distance, a mountain range so tall the peaks disappeared into low cloud. To the east, what looked like a city, or the edge of one, its towers catching the last light of whatever sun was setting somewhere behind the storm front. He had no idea where he was. He had a very strong feeling that he was not Japan. He also had a feeling, quieter, deeper, more unsettling than either of those, that something enormous was looking out through his eyes alongside him. Not controlling him. Not speaking to him. Just, present. Ancient and patient and so incomprehensibly large that acknowledging it fully felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. He didn't look at it directly. He filed it away for later. Later came faster than he expected. There were 12 of them at the crater's edge by the time he turned north. Soldiers, he registered, heavy plate armor in gold and crimson, visored helmets, weapons already drawn. Swords for the infantry. 2 with crossbows already raised. 1 with a spear that was humming with some kind of channeled energy, crackling blue at the tip. The one at the center, a broad-shouldered man with a commander's insignia and the particular posture of someone who had never in his life been asked to back down, had his hand raised in the halt signal, his eyes fixed on the crater with an expression caught somewhere between fury and fear. On the ground, the commander said. Now. Hands where I can see them. Izuku looked at the crossbow bolts pointed at him. He looked at the spear. He tilted his head slightly and felt the thing in the back of his awareness shift, the way a very large animal might shift its weight when it woke up to find something standing over it. I'm not going to hurt anyone, Izuku said. Ground. Now. This is your last warning. Izuku considered it genuinely. He looked at the scorched earth around him, at the shattered trees, at the sky that still felt wrong and electric. He looked at his hands again. I don't think, he said slowly, that lying on the ground is going to help anyone here understand what's happening. Including me. He looked up at the commander. Can you tell me where I am? The bolt hit him in the chest. He felt it. That was interesting, a sharp impact, a flash of pressure. But when he looked down, the bolt was on the ground at his feet, flattened against what felt like a wall that existed approximately half an inch in front of his skin. The second bolt followed a moment later, and he watched it fall the same way. The soldiers had gone very quiet. Veltharion, said a voice from somewhere behind the formation. You're in Veltharion. On the southern border of the Solmir Empire, to be precise. And you are standing in a crater that did not exist 40 minutes ago. A pause. Which is my road, incidentally. You've disrupted trade passage. The soldiers parted, and she walked through them like water through a gap in stone, unhurried, entirely without theatrical flourish, which somehow made it more commanding than any entrance he'd seen. She was tall, maybe his age or a few years older, with hair the deep red of embers and eyes that were the flat, assessing gray of someone who made decisions about armies before breakfast. The armor she wore was functional, not ceremonial, dented at the pauldron, a thin scar running along the left side of her jaw. A sword at her hip that she hadn't drawn. A crown she wasn't wearing, but which she carried in one hand with the casual indifference of someone who kept forgetting to put it back on. She stopped at the edge of the crater and looked at him with an expression that was entirely unreadable. You're him, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm Izuku Midoriya, he said. Or I was. I'm working on the current situation. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear. Something more like the look of a chess player who has just seen their opponent make an unexpected opening move and is rapidly recalculating everything. The seals broke 6 hours ago, she said. Every mage in my kingdom felt it. The Covenant scholar said it would mean the end of the world. Her gaze dropped to the flattened bolts on the ground between them. Then back to him. You don't look like the end of the world. I've been told that before, he said. And then, because he couldn't help it, because he was still Izuku Midoriya, curious and compulsive and constitutionally incapable of not engaging, he said, what are the seals? What was sealed? Her expression shifted. A very small thing, almost invisible, but he caught it, the fractional widening of those gray eyes, the slight adjustment of her jaw. She had not expected that question. You, she said. The seals were you. Aldrath, the demon dragon god. The last true apex entity of the old world. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't remember. I remember being hit by a truck, he said. The silence that followed was profound. I see, she said finally. Her name was Seraphine Orvale, Queen of Solmir, Warden of the Golden Reach, Commander of the Sun-Forged Legion, and approximately 12 other titles she recited later with the cadence of someone reading a tax document. She gave him a horse because he asked for one, he figured it was better than floating, which he was still not fully trusting himself to control, and they rode toward her city at a pace that suggested she was in a hurry but refused to show it. The soldiers kept a wide formation around them. Not surrounding him, exactly, more like they were trying to be near enough to respond to something and far enough away that whatever happened wouldn't immediately kill all of them. He respected the tactical honesty of it. Tell me about the old Aldrath, he said, as the violet grasslands gave way to cultivated fields and stonewall farmsteads. Why? Because I'm apparently him. Or his reincarnation. Or his vessel. I haven't worked out the specifics yet. He paused. I'd like to know what people are going to think when they look at me. She was quiet for a moment. The setting sun, it turned out there was a sun here, just slightly larger and more golden than the one he knew, painted the road amber and long. Aldrath was the first and last of his kind, she said. A being born at the collision of the dragon lineages and the old demon courts, 10,000 years ago, when this world was still being argued over by things that don't have names anymore. He wasn't created. He wasn't summoned. He simply occurred. Like a catastrophe occurs. She glanced at him sidelong. He ruled for 2,000 years. The entire continent under one power. Some histories call it the Golden Age. Others call it the Long Silence. Which is it? Both, she said. He wasn't cruel, by most accounts. He was simply so far beyond everything else that cruelty and kindness became somewhat academic. Things lived or didn't live based on whether they interested him. She paused. Toward the end, something changed. The historians disagree about what. He began burning kingdoms that hadn't defied him. He tore the void gate open and let something through that it took every remaining power in the world 300 years to push back. And then, abruptly, he stopped. He sealed himself away. Left behind a fragment of his power woven into the covenant of shattered crowns, a deterrent, a promise, a leash. And the world rebuilt. Izuku absorbed this. He watched a farmer in a distant field stop working and stare at their column, and then drop the tool he was holding and run inside. And now the seal is broken, he said. The seal is you, she corrected. You are the seal. You're also the thing the seal was containing. Which creates a rather interesting theological problem. He thought about the vast, patient presence in the back of his awareness. He thought about the crossbow bolt flattening against his skin. He thought about the crater he'd woken up in. What's your plan? He asked. For me, I mean. You could have let your soldiers keep shooting. She looked at him directly then, fully, in a way that felt like an assessment rather than a look. The bolts didn't work, she said. I wasn't going to waste my soldiers. Practical. Extremely. She looked forward again. Besides, you're inside my borders. I'd rather know what you intend to do before you do it. I don't have intentions yet, he said. I woke up an hour ago. Everyone has intentions, she said. You may not have named yours yet. He thought about that for the rest of the ride, and didn't argue. Samura's capital city was called Orvain, and it was built on a principle that was immediately legible to anyone who looked at it. Every structure was designed to make whoever entered it feel small. The gates were 60 feet tall. The main boulevard leading to the palace was wide enough for 8 carriages abreast. The palace itself sat at the city's center on an elevated platform of white stone, its towers catching the last sun in a way that made them look like burning candles. Izuku walked through the gate and felt the city notice him. It wasn't metaphorical. There was a quality to the air, a pressure shift, like everyone in the city had taken a breath at the same time and not yet released it. Civilians clearing the boulevard, some fleeing inward toward buildings, some frozen and staring. Children being pulled inside by parents who had seen things and knew better. A priest on the steps of a temple who had dropped his prayer bowl and was staring at Izuku with an expression that had moved past fear into something that looked uncomfortably like reverence. He kept walking. He kept his face calm and open. He made sure not to step too hard. Inside the palace, the council was already assembled, 7 men and women in various states of barely controlled panic, arrayed around a circular table in a war room decorated with military maps and the sigils of every kingdom in what he was gathering was called the Covenant. They went silent as he walked in. This is the situation, Seraphine said, without preamble, taking her place at the table's head and laying her crown down next to the map like a paperweight. The seal has broken. Aldrath is reborn. He is currently standing in my war room and does not appear to be immediately genocidal, which puts us ahead of every scenario Mage Chancellor Dravane predicted. She nodded at a man on her right who had the particular gray-faced look of someone whose worst professional projections had just come partially true. Travaine. Travaine stood. He was thin, wire-haired, somewhere in his 50s, with mage marks running up his wrists in the deep blue-black of old channeling. He looked at Izuku the way you looked at a mathematical proof that kept producing a paradox. The covenant requires the death or resealing of any entity that, the covenant, Izuku said, pleasantly, was built around a version of me that isn't here. I'm not him. The power is the same. The person isn't. He looked around the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, there was a quality to how he spoke now that he was still getting used to, a resonance, like each word had weight beyond its syllables. I'm going to be straightforward with you. I don't know everything about what I am yet. But I know that I walked into this room when I could have leveled the building instead. I know that I'm having a conversation when I could be doing something significantly less polite. He let that sit for a moment. I want to understand this world. I want to understand what's wrong with it and what it needs. That's not a threat. It's just what I am. The silence held. Seraphine was watching him with those gray eyes, and he had the feeling she was measuring something, though he couldn't tell what the measurement was for. What do you want from us? She asked. Information, he said. And honestly, a meal would be good. I've been dead for what feels like a while. Seraphine came herself, which surprised him. He'd expected a servant, or another council member. Instead she appeared in the doorway of his quarters 2 hours after the war room, still in her armor, with a bottle of wine that she set on the table across from him and then poured without asking whether he wanted any. How much do you know about the other kingdoms? She asked, sitting. Nothing, he said. You're my primary information source. Then I'll start with the problems. She spread a smaller map across the table, hand-drawn, annotated heavily in 3 colors of ink. She tapped each kingdom as she named it, which he appreciated. Visual and contextual simultaneously. Dravath has had assassins on the borders since the seals broke. They work fast. Thalindra is likely already repositioning their fleet. Vermount will hear about this by morning, and their Forge King, Thranos, is someone who interprets the return of an ancient god as a personal insult. She looked up. Eleshra and Nokrath will wait. They're cautious. Orwyn, a small pause, almost imperceptible, Orwyn will want to study you. And Solmir? He asked. Solmir, she said, is sitting across from you right now, trying to decide if you are an asset or a catastrophe. He looked at her. And? Jury's still out, she said, which was honest enough that he found himself respecting it more than any declaration of allegiance would have been. He picked up the wine. It was deep red, almost black, and tasted like something that had been cultivated with genuine patience. You built this empire alone, he said. A very slight shift in her posture. My counsel helped. You built this empire alone, he repeated, not unkindly. Your father was assassinated when you were 19. You took the throne before the body was cold because if you hadn't, the northern provinces would have seceded within a week. You've been fighting on 3 fronts at once for 6 years and you're winning all 3. He paused. I'm observant. I also apparently have access to some things the old Aldrath knew, and he paid attention. The shift in her posture this time was more pronounced. Not defensiveness, something more complicated. The look of someone who had been seen accurately for the first time in a while and wasn't sure how to hold it. Is this where you tell me I need you? She asked. No, he said. I think you've made it abundantly clear you don't need anyone. This is where I tell you that I'm here, and I'm going to be here for a while, and I'd rather we be honest with each other from the start. Whatever this becomes. He set down the wine. I don't want to rule. I'm not interested in being a weapon or a symbol or a theological event. I want to understand this world and fix what's broken in it. He met her eyes. And you're the first person I've spoken to here who isn't afraid of me. That's not nothing. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The war room light caught the scar along her jaw, the dents in her armor, the crown she'd carried all the way from the road and now sat slightly askew at the corner of the table. "I am afraid of you," she said finally. "I'm just better at it than most people." He smiled. He couldn't help it. It was so thoroughly, exhaustively honest that something in his chest, the Izuku Midoriya part, the part that had grown up cataloging heroes and their qualities in careful notebooks, catalogued her, right there, in the same column as the best ones. "That's fair," he said. She looked down at the map, and then she started explaining the world to him. Not the political surface of it, but the actual shape of it, the fault lines, the tensions, the histories that treaties had papered over without healing. She spoke for an hour without stopping, and he listened with the complete, undivided attention that had always been one of his most unnerving qualities, leaning forward with his elbows on the table and his eyes tracking everything. Outside the palace windows, the city was quiet. But all across Veltharion, he understood, lights were being lit in war rooms very much like this one. Flags were being moved on maps. Riders were being dispatched. The seal had broken. Everyone was deciding what to do about it. He couldn't sleep. He hadn't tried very hard, lying down in the vast, overfurnished bed felt somehow wrong, like putting a wolf in a kennel, and after 20 minutes he gave up and went to the window. The window was tall enough to walk through without ducking, which he appreciated, and he sat in the frame with one knee up and looked out at the city of Orvain at what he estimated was the 3rd hour of the morning. The presence in the back of his awareness was closer now. Quieter during the day while he was active and engaged, but here in the stillness it was more distinct, like a second heartbeat slightly out of sync with his own. He turned toward it the way he'd been avoiding all day, not flinching away. It wasn't hostile. That was the first thing he understood. There was no aggression in it, no will pressing against his, it was more like a vast library that existed in his blood, ancient knowledge stored in the architecture of his power. He couldn't read it all at once. He couldn't read most of it. But there were things he could access, the way you access things you'd learned so long ago they'd stopped feeling like knowledge and started feeling like instinct. He held his right hand out over the window sill, palm up, and thought of fire. What came out was not fire. It was something that looked like fire the way a star looks like a candle, the same general principle scaled to a magnitude that made the comparison absurd. Black flame edged in deep crimson and gold, coiling up from his palm in slow, almost lazy spirals, and where it rose the air shimmered with a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the heat of potential. The heat of something that existed at the boundary of what physics was prepared to accommodate. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed his hand and it went out, and the night felt very ordinary afterward. He thought about the kid with the ball. He thought about the truck. He thought about the notebook with no name in it. He thought about his mother, who would wake up to a phone call that would destroy her, and he sat with that grief honestly rather than pushing it away, because grief was real and it deserved to be felt properly. Then he thought about the city below him, and the world beyond it, and the map on the war table with all its fault lines. He thought about Seraphine, who was afraid of him and said so to his face. He thought about the council members calculating their positions in a new world order. He thought about the farmer who had run inside at the sight of the column, and the priest who had dropped his bowl, and the soldiers whose crossbow bolts were lying flat in a crater somewhere on the south road. He thought about what it meant to have this much power in a world that was already fracturing. The old Aldrath had let things live or die based on whether they interested him. Izuku thought that was probably where they diverged most fundamentally. Because everything interested him. Every person, every problem, every broken system and unresolved tension and story that hadn't found its ending yet. It had gotten him in trouble his entire life, this incapacity for selective caring, this inability to walk past something that needed fixing without stopping. He supposed it was probably still going to get him in trouble here. He found he didn't particularly mind. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the vast, idle power moving through him like a tide, and looked out at the dark skyline of Orvain, with its towers and its 60-foot gates and its citizens who had gone to bed tonight in a world that had shifted under them without warning. "All right," he said quietly, to no one, to both of them, to Izuku and to Aldrath and to whatever combination of the two was sitting in this window right now. "Let's figure this out." Somewhere in the city below, a bell began to ring. Not an alarm, a slow, rhythmic tolling from the temple district, the kind that meant something had been confirmed, something official and undeniable had been entered into the record. He counted the strikes. 12. The old count, Seraphine had mentioned, 12 strikes meant the Covenant was formally notified of a seal breaking. The other kingdoms would know by morning. Good, he thought, which surprised him a little with its certainty. Let them know. Let them come with their armies and their assassins and their arcane research and their territorial fury. Let them see what was here. He wasn't hiding. He hadn't been hiding as a quirkless kid in a world of quirks, not truly. He'd been working, always moving toward the thing he was reaching for. He wasn't going to start hiding now. He jumped down from the window frame, landed soundlessly on the stone floor despite the height he'd been sitting at, and went to find the palace kitchen because he was, improbably, still hungry. He passed 2 guards in the corridor who flattened themselves against the wall, rigid with something between protocol and instinct. He gave them both a nod and kept walking. Behind him, one of the guards exhaled like he'd been holding it since the previous afternoon. The other whispered something in a voice pitched low, probably not intended to carry. Izuku's hearing, it turned out, was now exceptional. What the guard whispered was, "He's so normal-looking." Izuku almost laughed. He kept walking, smiling at the corridor wall, and thought that being normal-looking was probably the best armor he had. Morning arrived with the particular indifference mornings had everywhere. Regardless of what the world had decided the previous day, the sun came up and the birds that lived in the palace gardens made their noise and servants began moving through the corridors with the purposeful efficiency of people who had decided that the presence of an ancient reborn deity was not going to prevent breakfast from being served on time. He was already awake. He'd been in the palace library for 2 hours, working through a history of the Covenant of Shattered Crowns with the focused intensity that had filled every notebook he'd ever owned. The librarian, a small, elderly woman with spectacles on a chain who had apparently seen enough in her decades of service to take this in stride, had simply pointed him toward the relevant shelf and returned to her cataloging. Seraphine found him there at sunrise, and for a moment, standing in the library doorway with the early light coming in behind her, she looked surprised despite herself. He got the impression she'd been expecting to find him at the training grounds, or on the roof, or doing something demonstrably godlike. Instead he was sitting cross-legged on the floor between 2 shelves with 4 books open around him and his finger tracking a passage about the geography of the Void Gate. "You read Veilfairy's script," she said. "Since about an hour ago," he said. "The language came with the territory." "Most of it." He looked up. "Good morning." She looked at him for a moment longer and then, with the pragmatism that seemed to be her fundamental operating principle, stepped around the books and crouched to look at the page he was reading. "That's the Dravane Codex. It's technically restricted to mage scholars." The librarian didn't mention that. The librarian is 92 years old and has decided that most institutional rules are someone else's problem. He laughed at that, a real one, short and genuine, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Something about it was careful. "The council has been sending messages since dawn," she said. "Dravath wants a summit. Thalindra has moved 3 warships to our harbor at Kaelvan. Vermouth has sent an envoy whose first sentence included the word abomination. Which one is the most urgent?" She sat on the floor across from him, which he hadn't expected, and pulled the Thalindra report from the stack she was carrying. "Thalindra. 3 warships is a message, not an attack. But Thalindra Vel doesn't send messages without meaning them, and she has," she paused, "a lot of ships." He looked at the report. Then at the map he'd been cross-referencing. Then back at her. "Tell me about Thalindra Vel," he said, reaching for the next book. Outside, the palace bells began the morning count, and across the whole of Orvane, a city was waking up to the first day of a world that had fundamentally changed. In the library, Izuku Midoriya, or Aldrath, or whatever the universe needed him to be right now, was doing what he had always done. Taking notes. Chapter 2, A Court of Knives and Curiosity. The summit announcement reached Samura's court in the form of a letter that smelled faintly of something sweet and wrong, like flowers laid over a grave. Izuku noticed it the moment Seraphine's courier set it on the war table, a thin chemical note underneath the wax seal, almost imperceptible. He filed it away and said nothing, watching instead as Dravane broke the seal with a mage knife and unrolled the scroll with the careful hands of a man defusing something. The message was from Dravatha's Shadow Court. 3 sentences. That was all. The first acknowledged the breaking of the seals. The second expressed Dravatha's desire to participate in whatever political restructuring was forthcoming. The third offered, with silken formality, to send a representative to Solmir within the week to begin preliminary discussions. No, said Councillor Brenneth, the oldest and loudest member of the table, whose primary function seemed to be expressing the opinion that every situation was more dangerous than Seraphine was treating it. Absolutely not. A Dravath representative inside these walls while, he gestured at Izuku without looking at him, while this is happening? That's an invitation for, it's a test, Izuku said. Brenneth stopped. Izuku was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not seated at the table. He declined the chair they'd offered him, which had caused a small crisis of protocol that Seraphine had resolved by simply moving on. Dravath wants to see how we respond. If we refuse, they read it as fear. If we agree too quickly, they read it as desperation. He looked at Seraphine. What's the response that unsettles them most? Her eyes were already doing the thing he'd noticed, a slight sharpening, a recalibration. Enthusiasm, she said. Enthusiasm, he agreed. Write back and tell them we welcome the representative and they're welcome to bring whomever they like. He smiled slightly. Let Dravath figure out what to do with a god who's excited to meet them. The council exchanged glances. Dravane made a small, reluctant sound that might have been professional approval. Seraphine wrote the reply herself. The week moved fast. Izuku spent it learning, which for him was an active process. He didn't sit with books alone but moved through the city, the palace, the barracks, asking questions of everyone from Seraphine's senior generals to the stable hands who had the practical knowledge of how things actually functioned day to day. He learned the currency system, the military structure, the trade routes, the social stratifications, the religious landscape which was complicated and layered and fascinating. He learned the way power moved through Solmir, not through the crown alone but through a web of old military families and mercantile guilds whose allegiances Seraphine managed with the precision of someone playing a dozen games of chess simultaneously. He also learned, by the third day, that he was being followed. Not by Seraphine's people, her guards were obvious, institutional, positioned at standard intervals. This was something else. A shadow that appeared in his peripheral vision in the market district and then wasn't there when he turned. A presence in the palace corridors at night that moved too quietly for servants and too precisely for anything casual. On the 4th day he caught a scent, that same sweet wrong note from the letter, faint but consistent, and understood. The Dravath representative had not waited for the official visit. He said nothing about it. He went about his days and let whoever it was think they were invisible, partly because springing the trap prematurely was wasteful and partly because he was genuinely curious how long they'd wait and what their orders were. On the 5th evening, he found out. He'd gone to the East Garden after dinner, mostly because the palace's interior had begun feeling close and he'd been craving sky. The garden was a formal thing, clipped hedges, stone pathways, a fountain at the center with a carved military figure pouring water from a shield. Not particularly comfortable, but open. He sat on the fountain's edge and looked up at the dual moons that Veltharion apparently had, one large and amber and one small and white, and thought about nothing in particular in the way that only worked when something specific was about to happen. She dropped from the hedge to his left with the absolute silence of someone who had been trained from childhood to treat air as a medium to move through rather than displace. He heard her anyway. He'd heard her 3 steps back. She was dressed in Dravatha's characteristic shadow cloth, a material that didn't absorb light so much as redirect it, making the edges of her figure slightly uncertain in low lighting. Her mask was the lower half variety, leaving her eyes exposed, and her eyes were extraordinary, a pale, almost colorless silver gray, the kind of eyes that gave nothing away because they'd been trained to give nothing away, and the training had been rigorous and long. The blade she had at his throat was a work of genuine craftsmanship. Narrow, slightly curved, coated with something that caught the moonlight with a faint iridescent shimmer that told him it wasn't a decorative choice. "Don't move," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone running a professional protocol. He looked at the blade. He looked at her. He looked back at the moons. "That's a contact venom," he said. "On the blade. Probably something that disrupts arcane channeling, destabilizes the connection between a mage and their power source. Smart approach for dealing with something god-tier, theoretically." He paused. "It won't work on me, but the theory is sound." A silence. "How did you, the smell," he said. "You changed the carrier compound from the letter but the base is the same. Dravathian black flower extract." He finally looked at her directly. "Also, you've been following me for 3 days and I've had nothing interesting to think about, so I've been running through possible scenarios. Assassination was the most likely." The blade hadn't moved. He gave her credit for that. Most people, caught in this situation, would have either committed or retreated by now. She was holding the in-between space with remarkable composure. "You're not afraid," she said. "No. You should be." "Probably," he agreed. "Do you want to keep the blade there or do you want to talk?" "I genuinely don't mind either way, but I'll mention that if you push that venom through my skin and nothing happens, you lose your primary contingency, and then we're talking anyway." Another silence. Longer this time. He felt rather than saw her recalibrate, a subtle shift in her breathing, the micro-adjustment of her weight distribution. She was reassessing. Good. That was the right response. She lowered the blade. "Sit down if you want," he said, moving over on the fountain edge. "The stone's cold but the view is good." She stood where she was for a moment, and he could tell, something in the set of her shoulders, the way her chin had lifted a fraction, that she was deeply, structurally unaccustomed to this particular experience. Not refusal. Not threat escalation. Just a person on a fountain who had made room. She sat. Not close, she left a careful distance, the blade disappearing into whatever architectural mystery her clothing contained. She looked at the moons. "You were going to let me try it," she said. Not accusing. Observing. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted to see what you'd do next." He glanced at her. "And because no one who plans that carefully deserves to have the plan interrupted before it gets to demonstrate its quality." She turned her head to look at him. The mask was still in place, but above it, those silver eyes were doing something complicated. Processing, he thought. She was someone who processed quickly and thoroughly and was currently dealing with data that didn't fit her existing models. "Who are you?" she asked. "Right now I'm Aldrath. Before that I was Izuku Midoriya. The combination is still being worked out." He extended his hand. "And you're a Dravath shadow dancer, probably court rank given the quality of the shadow cloth, sent ahead of the official envoy either to gather intelligence or to kill me before the summit could complicate things. Which was it?" She looked at his hand. She looked at him. Then, with a precision that suggested the gesture cost her something, she took it. "Both," she said. "Gather intelligence first. Eliminate if assessment warranted it." "And the assessment?" A pause. "Inconclusive." He smiled. "I'll take that." "You really don't know what you are yet," she said. It wasn't a question, exactly. "I know what I can do," he said. I'm still figuring out who I'm supposed to be in this world. He released her hand. Tell me about Dravath. She looked at him for a long time. Why? Because you came here with a knife and I'd rather have a conversation. The moons moved a little across their arc. The fountain's carved soldier kept pouring water into the basin, steady and indifferent to theology. And slowly, with the particular careful quality of someone laying down something they'd been holding tightly for a long time, she began to talk. Her name was Nyx. Just that, shadow dancers of sufficient rank in Dravath's court dropped surnames the way soldiers dropped unnecessary weight before a march. She was the Shadow Queen's third and highest ranked operative, which meant in practice that she was sent to situations where the first two ranks had already failed or been eliminated. She had never failed an assignment. She also, it became clear as the night deepened, had a mind like a drawn wire, taut, precise, capable of enormous tension without breaking. She spoke about Dravath with the practiced neutrality of official reporting and then, when he asked specific enough questions, began speaking about it differently, with the small, telling inflections of someone who actually knew the place and had opinions about what was wrong with it. The Shadow Court was old. Older than the current queen, older than the current dynasty, a structure of intelligence and assassination that had outlasted every political upheaval of the past 1,000 years by the simple expedient of being more useful than threatening to whoever held power. In theory, it served Dravath as queen. In practice, the court had its own interests, its own internal politics, its own definition of what constituted an acceptable outcome. Nyx served both. She was good enough at it that the contradiction had never become untenable. Until now, he sensed. Until something had shifted under the equilibrium she'd built, and she wasn't saying what it was, but it was there in the negative spaces of what she described. He didn't push. He filed it away. You'll stay for the summit, he said, when she'd been quiet for a moment. She looked at him sharply. Not as an assassin, he said. The other thing. The observation. He met her eyes. You're better at reading courts than your official representative will be. And I'd rather have someone in the room who's honest about what they're doing. I'm an assassin, she said flatly. That is functionally the opposite of honest. You've been honest with me for the last 2 hours. The silence this time had a different quality. Softer at the edges. She looked away, at the fountain, and he watched the shadowcloth shift at her shoulder as she did. I could still be manipulating you, she said. You could, he agreed. But you're not. He stood up, stretching. The East Wing has a room next to the library that doesn't get used. The librarian knows where the spare key is and won't mention it to anyone, since she's 92 and considers most things none of her business. He looked at her. Sleep somewhere better than a hedge. He walked back toward the palace without looking back. Behind him, after a moment, he heard the soft sound of shadowcloth moving across stone. The official Dravath delegation arrived the next morning with considerable ceremony and considerably less information than Nyx had given him in 2 hours by a fountain. The Shadow Court's official envoy was a man named Corvith, tall, performatively gracious, with the rehearsed warmth of someone who'd been professionally charming since adolescence. He brought gifts, which Seraphine accepted with the expression of someone cataloging them for potential tampering. He made speeches, which the council received with the stillness of people waiting for the part that mattered. Izuku watched from his position at the room's edge and noticed that Corvith never once looked at him directly. Always peripheral. Always just past. He was being treated as a fact to be managed rather than a person to be addressed, which told him a great deal about the Shadow Court's current stance. He let it run through its ceremony. He let Seraphine manage the formal exchange. She was extraordinary at it, he'd learned, a completely different kind of sharp in political spaces than in military ones, her language structured for maximum precision with minimum revelation. Then Corvith said something that made the whole room shift. Dravath's position, he said, smoothly, setting down his wine, is that the Covenant's Clause 7 must be invoked. We recognize the complexity of the current situation, naturally, and we have no desire for conflict. But the legal and theological frameworks established by the covenant are binding on all signatories, and the entity present in this room falls within the parameters of Clause 7, Izuku said, is the resealing provision. Corvith finally looked at him. Full and direct, for the first time. His expression didn't change, professionally admirable. It provides for the resealing or elimination of any apex entity that, I know what it provides, Izuku said. He pushed off the wall and walked to the table, and the room adjusted around him the way rooms tended to adjust around him now, a subtle expansion of space, people shifting back without quite realizing they were doing it. He stopped across from Corvith and looked at him with the same open, attentive expression he'd had since he walked in. I want to ask you something. Corvith waited. Who sent you? Izuku asked. Not Draveth. Not the Shadow Court. Who, specifically, decided that the first formal move should be invoking Clause 7? A fractional pause. The Shadow Court operates as a collective. No, it doesn't, Izuku said. It has a hierarchy, and decisions of this weight come from the top where they don't get made. So who made this one? He held Corvith's gaze. I'm asking because I want to understand what Draveth actually wants, versus what someone in Draveth wants. There's usually a difference. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of experienced political actors collectively realizes that the variable they'd been accounting for as a blunt force catastrophe has just demonstrated surgical precision. Seraphine, to her credit, showed nothing. But he caught the fractional tightening at the corner of her mouth that he'd learned meant she was filing something away at high priority. Corvith recovered well. I represent the consolidated position of, you're very good at this, Izuku said, not unkindly. We'll continue it tomorrow. Tonight there's a dinner, I believe. He looked at Seraphine. At seventh bell, she confirmed, with the smooth inevitability of someone who had decided to let this play out and see where it landed. Corvith smiled. It was a good smile, practiced. Of course, he said. We look forward to it. The dinner was a performance of the highest caliber and everyone at the table knew it and no one acknowledged it, which was its own kind of art form. Seraphine hosted with the precision of a general managing a battlefield she'd chosen herself, every seat placement deliberate, every dish a statement, the wine selected to be good enough to appreciate but not so exceptional as to suggest anyone was trying to impress. Izuku sat at her right, which had caused a brief, fierce internal debate in the council that Seraphine had ended by simply announcing the seating and moving on. Corvith sat across from him, flanked by two junior delegates who spoke when Corvith didn't need them to and were silent when he did. Nyx was not at the dinner table. But she was in the room, or rather, she was in the gallery above the room, which ran the length of the hall and was nominally used for musicians on formal occasions. He'd caught her scent when he walked in. He did not look up. The dinner moved through its courses. Conversation was structured in the way formal diplomatic meals structured conversation, careful, wide-orbit topics that let everyone demonstrate their intelligence without revealing anything actionable. History. Trade theory. Military philosophy at a sufficiently abstract level to be safely academic. Corvith was brilliant at it, Izuku admitted. He shaped sentences that sounded like statements but functioned as questions, gathered information while appearing to offer it. It was, objectively, impressive work. It was also completely wasted on Izuku, who was simply answering what he was asked accurately, which was itself a form of control, because when you said true things in a room full of people engineering false impressions, you became the most unpredictable person in the space. Corvith asked, midway through the main course, what Izuku's intentions were regarding the Covenant. The Covenant is a document, Izuku said. Documents serve the needs of the time that wrote them. This is a different time. He cut into the meat on his plate, something the kitchen had prepared specifically for him after discovering he'd eaten 3 servings of everything at the previous dinner, a fact that had apparently caused considerable discussion about what gods ate. I'm not interested in dismantling it. I'm interested in understanding what it was actually trying to protect and whether it's still doing that. And if it isn't? Then it should change, he said. That's not a threat. That's just how functional systems work. He looked at Corvith. What is Dravith most afraid of? Not officially. Actually. A beat of silence. Instability, Corvith said, after a moment. And it was genuine, he could tell, not because Corvith had broken form, but because the specific quality of the word was different from everything else he'd said all evening. Less constructed. Heavier. Then we want the same thing, Izuku said. He picked up his wine. Dravith has maintained the balance of this continent for 200 years through information and selective pressure. That's not a small thing. A world where that capability is used for stability rather than for factional advantage is a better world. He met Corvith's eyes. Tell your principals that. Corvith looked at him for a moment with something real behind his professional expression, a glimpsed country behind a painted curtain. You're not what anyone expected, he said. I get that a lot, Izuku said. The attempt came 2 hours after dinner, which was faster than he'd predicted. He'd put the probability at the following morning. He was in his quarters, going over the notes he'd made during the dinner, an old habit, organizing observations before sleep so nothing degraded overnight, when the window opened with a sound that was not quite silence but was as close as the physical world permitted. There were 4 of them, and they were not Nyx's caliber. They were good, the entry was clean, the positions they took in the room were tactically sound, the first strike came quickly enough to preclude most responses. 2 went for immobilization, 1 went for the throat, 1 positioned at the door. Izuku sighed. He didn't move aggressively. He simply became very present in the room, and the quality of that presence, the thing that shifted when he stopped moderating it, made all 4 of them stop at the same instant with the particular frozen quality of animals encountering something that registered below conscious thought as categorically wrong to attack. You're from the Shadow Court, he said. The internal faction, not Corvith's delegation. Someone decided they didn't want to wait for the summit to resolve itself. He looked at them, one by one, with the patient clarity of someone doing taxonomy. Which means someone in Dravith's internal structure decided I was more dangerous contained than managed, and they're willing to move against their own queen's official diplomatic position to make that call. He paused. That's a civil war waiting to happen. Who sent you? The one at his throat, she hadn't quite reached him, was holding position a foot away, blade extended, said nothing. Professional. He respected it. He reached out and, with the particular precise care of someone who understood force in its finest gradations, took the blade from her hand. Not violently. Just took it, the way you take something from a child who had picked up something sharp, except he was a god and she was excellent and both of those things were true simultaneously. She let it happen, because there was nothing else to do. He turned the blade over in his hands. Same Shadow Court craftsmanship. Different marking on the hilt, a sub-sigil he didn't recognize from Nyx's description of the court's ranking structures. There's a faction, he said, half to himself. They'll send more, the woman said. First words she'd spoken, bidden out with the particular fury of professional pride meeting an impossible situation. Whatever you are. They'll keep sending. I know, he said. But whoever they are, they gave themselves away tonight. And tomorrow, Corvith is going to get some very interesting information from an anonymous source, and the internal faction that just tried to assassinate a deity against their queen's diplomatic instructions is going to have a very bad week. He looked at the 4 of them. You're free to go. None of them moved for a moment. Go, he said. Tell them what happened. Tell them exactly what happened, that you came in clean, ran the entry perfectly, and it didn't matter. Tell them I took the blade. He held it up. And tell them I kept the blade, because I liked it. They went. The window was the exit, as it had been the entrance, and they were gone with the efficient silence of people with significant amounts of professional shame to process. He set the blade on the table next to his notes. He was aware of Nyx before she spoke, had been aware of her in the corridor outside his door since approximately 30 seconds after the 4 had entered. She'd been there the whole time, and she hadn't intervened, which he found more interesting than if she had. "You could have stopped it earlier," she said, from the doorway. She'd come in off the corridor, which meant she'd had a key, or done something that functioned as one. "I know," he said. "You let them run it." "I needed to see the hilt marking," he said. "And I wanted to see what you'd do." Silence. "What would you have done," she asked carefully, "if I'd come in with them?" He looked at her. "You weren't going to." "How do you know?" "Because if you were going to kill me, you'd do it yourself, and you'd do it when I was actually vulnerable, not when you'd already had 2 hours of conversation at a fountain where I demonstrated you can't catch me off guard." He picked up the blade and held it out to her. "Hilt first. The faction that sent them, they're not your people." She took the blade. Looked at the sub-sigil on the hilt. Something shifted in her expression, something that looked like the confirmation of a suspicion she'd been carrying for a long time and hadn't wanted to validate. "No," she said. "They're not. Tell me about them." She came fully into the room, pulled a chair from the desk, and sat in it with the particular upright posture of someone who had been taught to sit that way and had done it for so long it was simply how she sat. She turned the blade over in her hands the same way he had. "There's a man," she said. "In Dravatha's lower districts. He's been there a long time, longer than he should have been, based on his reported age. He's not a shadow dancer. He's not officially connected to the court." She paused. "But people connected to him keep appearing in places they shouldn't be, doing things that benefit no visible principle." She looked up. "He funded this faction. I don't know what he wants. But he's been moving pieces for years." Izuku was very still. "How old?" he asked. "Old enough that the records don't agree on it," she said. "Some say 60. Some say 100. The oldest references, in the court's deepest archives, are dated 300 years ago. Same name. Same description." She set the blade on the table between them. "That shouldn't be possible. In this world," he said, "or any world, that's not old age. That's something deliberate." He looked at the blade. He looked at her. "His name." "Cassiel," she said. The word landed on the room with a weight that had nothing to do with its syllables. The vast, patient presence in the back of his awareness moved, shifted like something stirring in deep water, and for just a moment the temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees without any physical cause. Nyx felt it. He saw it in her eyes, not fear, exactly, but the instinct-level acknowledgement of something old and significant. "You know that name," she said. "He knew me," Izuku said. "The first version of me." He was quiet for a moment, processing the thing that was surfacing from the deep library of inherited knowledge, fragments, impressions, the sensation of enormity without clear detail. He was a general. The original Aldratha's most trusted commander. He looked at the window the 4 assassins had used. "He's been waiting 10,000 years." The room was quiet. "For what?" Nyx asked. Izuku picked up the blade again, ran his thumb along the flat. The sub-sigil caught the lamplight. "For me," he said. "The question is which version of me he thinks he's getting." Nyx watched him. He could see her recalibrating, the same way she had at the fountain, her models shifting to accommodate something she hadn't built for. But this time there was something underneath the recalibration that looked more like alignment than assessment. Like someone finding an angle they'd been looking for. "What do you do with that?" she asked. "For now. I find out more." He set the blade down with finality. "Corvith gets the information tomorrow through official channels, the attack, the hilt marking, the sub-sigil. Dravatha's queen will respond. That shakes the faction loose and tells me how Cassiel reacts to exposure." He looked at her. "Can you get me the archive records? The 300-year references?" "Stealing from the Dravath court's deepest archives," she said, with the flat intonation of someone reading from a list of inadvisable actions. "You've done harder things." A pause. Yes, she said. I have. She stood, picked up the blade and made it disappear into her shadow cloth with the practiced ease of reflex. It'll take 2 weeks. The archives aren't in Dravatha's capital. There's a secondary vault in. She stopped herself. Looked at him. Made a decision. I'll handle it. He nodded. Thank you. She moved toward the window, then stopped. With her back to him, looking at the frame, she said, the fountain. Last night. You moved over. Yes. Nobody moves over, she said. When people encounter something they're afraid of or don't understand, they push it away or they try to contain it. They don't. She stopped again. Make room, he said. Silence. You're very strange, she said, and went out the window with the absolute ease of someone for whom windows were simply horizontal doors. He looked at the empty frame for a moment. The night air came in, cool and carrying that faint mineral sharpness he was beginning to associate with this world's particular quality of atmosphere. Then he turned back to his notes, added several new entries, and went to bed. He slept better than he expected, which probably should have worried him more than it did. Morning arrived again with its customary indifference. The diplomatic breakfast with Corvith was a precise, choreographed event that lasted 40 minutes and resolved exactly nothing officially while establishing several important unofficial understandings. Corvith departed at midday with his delegation, the gifts, and a sealed message from Seraphine that was polite and completely non-committal. He watched them go from the palace gates. Seraphine appeared at his shoulder. She'd been there about 10 seconds before she spoke, which was becoming a pattern. She liked to observe before engaging, and he'd noticed she did it with him specifically, as if she was always making sure of something before beginning. The summit went better than projected, she said. It went exactly as projected, he corrected. Corvith came with the Clause 7 gambit, discovered it wasn't going to work, and left with a much more complicated picture than he arrived with. Dravath will recalibrate. We have 2 weeks before the next formal move. He watched the last of the delegation's carriages disappear through the city gate. Thalindra is more urgent. I know. 3 ships is a message. But what's the message? He turned to her. What does Thalindra Vel actually want? Seraphine was quiet for a moment. The morning sun hit the scar along her jaw and the gold of her pauldron simultaneously, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had been made out of the specific materials that this empire required, hard and bright and built to last. Acknowledgement, she said finally. She's the oldest of the 7 rulers. Oldest being relative, she's a half-sea spirit, so old that the current covenant was negotiated by people she watched being born. She's seen every political upheaval of the last 3 centuries. She maintains her kingdom through being more trouble than she's worth to fight, not through genuine alliance with anyone. A pause. She's never been met on equal terms. Because there's never been anyone close enough to her level, he said. Until now. He looked at the harbor district, visible from the gates, the distant blue of the bay, the masts of trade ships. 3 warships somewhere beyond that. Waiting. I'll go to her, he said. Seraphine turned to look at him fully. She's at sea. I know. Alone? Yes. The look she gave him was one he'd learned to read. It wasn't concern, exactly, because Seraphine had thoroughly accepted on some fundamental level that nothing was going to physically endanger him in any conventional sense. It was something more personal than that. More specific to him. I'll be back in 2 days, he said. 3 at most. She held his gaze for a moment. The northern trade ships pass through Kael'van on even days, she said. Their captains know the currents. Noted. He paused. Hold the council off Vermount's envoy until I'm back. Don't let Brenneth draft anything. I was going to do that anyway, she said, with the dignified finality of someone who hadn't needed the advice but wasn't going to make a thing of it. He left the following morning at dawn, alone, walking through the city as it woke up around him, the bakers, the merchants, the children chasing each other in the side streets, the old woman on the corner who sold flowers and had stopped being afraid of him on day 3 when he'd bought a handful of something purple she called crowsbloom, and she'd corrected his pronunciation twice and seemed to feel better about everything after that. He bought crowsbloom again today. He tucked it into his belt for no practical reason whatsoever. At the city's southern gate, the guards on duty, different men from the ones who'd gone rigid in the corridor that first night, but with the same institutional adjustment to his presence, the salute that was half ceremony and half genuine, waved him through. The road to the coast was long and the morning was clear, and somewhere ahead, ancient and vast and waiting, the ocean was holding 3 warships in a very particular position. Izuku walked, and somewhere behind him the city went about its morning, and somewhere in front of him the world waited to see what kind of god had come back to it. The kind that made room, he thought, was probably the answer. He kept walking. Chapter 3, The Tide remembers everything. The coast road took him through 3 fishing villages before it ran out of road entirely and became cliff. The villages were small, salt-weathered things, stone walls gone grey with sea spray, nets hung out to dry between poles, children who stopped and stared with the uncomplicated directness that children had before adults taught them what to do with faces around things they didn't understand. In the second village, a woman hanging laundry watched him pass and then called something to her neighbor, and the neighbor came to the door and watched too, and neither of them ran or grabbed anything threatening. Just watched. He waved. They waved back, with the cautious automatic quality of people responding before they'd thought better of it. He liked this world, he decided. It was frightened and fractured and operating on a geopolitical fault line, but the people in it had the same quality that people everywhere had. They went about their days, they hung their laundry, they called to their neighbors. The shape of ordinary life was, it turned out, fairly universal. At the cliff's edge he stopped and looked out. The Kelvin Sea was enormous. Even by the standards of oceans he'd seen in photographs and on screens, it had a scale that felt personal, the kind of vastness that pressed against you, that made the inside of your chest feel simultaneously larger and smaller. The water was a deep blue-green shot through with currents of darker indigo where the depths changed, and the horizon was so clear and hard it looked architectural. The 3 warships were there, exactly where Seraphine had mapped them, positioned in a loose triangular formation about 2 miles offshore, anchored, their sails furled. They weren't moving. They were waiting. He studied them for a moment. Each ship was enormous, deep-hulled, triple-masted, with the particular architectural confidence of vessels built by people who took the sea seriously and had been doing it for generations. Their flags were Thalindra's colors, deep blue and the silver of sea foam. He stepped off the cliff. Not falling, he caught the air about 6 feet down with the easy reflex he was developing for weight and movement, and simply walked forward into nothing at a slight downward angle until his feet found the water's surface. He landed on the ocean like it was a floor that had agreed to hold him, which it had, because the physics of this world had apparently also received the theological memo. The water was cold through his boots. He could feel the enormous, living pressure of the deep beneath him, not threatening, just present, the way the presence in the back of his awareness was present. The sea was old. He could feel its age, distinct from the land's age, a different quality of time altogether. Liquid time. Continuous, uninterrupted. He walked toward the ships. The sun was moving past its high point when he covered the 2 miles, which meant he'd been walking on water for roughly 40 minutes, which he spent thinking about Cassiel. The name kept surfacing, pulling things up with it, not memories, exactly, more like the structural outline of memories, shapes without content. A general. The original Aldrath's most trusted. 10,000 years of deliberate survival. That wasn't devotion, he thought. Nobody waited 10,000 years out of simple loyalty. That was obsession of a very specific and very dangerous variety, the kind born from a singular, fixed idea about how the world was supposed to be, nursed through centuries until it had calcified from desire into certainty. He'd have to understand it before he confronted it. That was non-negotiable. The ships had seen him by the time he was a quarter mile out. He could see movement on the decks, figures at the railings, the quick organized motion of crews who were good at their jobs responding to something unprecedented. He kept walking at the same pace, hands open at his sides, and let them adjust to the sight of a person walking on water toward them. When he was 50 yards out, a voice came from the lead ship, not shouted, which was interesting, but projected, carried on the air with a deliberate quality that suggested the speaker was doing something intentional with the sound. "Stop there." He stopped. The voice was not what he'd expected. He hadn't formed a precise expectation, but whatever shape it had been in his mind, the reality was different, deeper than the pitch suggested, layered in a way that reminded him of the sea itself, harmonic and ancient. Not old like a person was old. Old like geology. A figure appeared at the prow of the lead ship, and even at 50 yards he could see her clearly. She was tall, dressed in something that moved like water and probably was water, or at least shared its basic allegiances. Her hair was dark and long and wet, which made no sense from a logistical standpoint. She hadn't been in the water recently, but some things apparently worked on their own terms. Her skin had that same quality his did, the luminous deep water quality, but more pronounced, more comfortable in itself. A being that had had 10,000 more years to settle into what it was. She looked at him across the water. He looked back. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. "I've heard that," he said. "Are you going to invite me up, or are we doing this from here?" A pause. The water around him moved in a slow, complex pattern, not a current, something more deliberate. He felt it against his feet through the surface he was standing on. The sea's equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "You walked here," she said. "The road ran out." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Come up." A rope ladder didn't appear, instead a section of the hull opened, a door he hadn't noticed, and a ramp of water extended from it to the surface, sloping up in a way that defied the physics of liquids unless the liquid was paying attention. He walked up it, stepped through the door into the ship's interior, and heard the ramp dissolve behind him. Her name in full was Thalindra Vel, which she said was both her name and her kingdom's name, and the distinction had long since stopped being meaningful. She had named the kingdom, or the kingdom had been named for her, or they had simply arrived at the same name independently, and she had stopped being interested in which version was accurate sometime around the 3rd century. She took him to a room at the ship's heart that felt more like a cave than a cabin, curved stone walls that should not have been on a ship, smooth and sea-dark, with water moving through the stone itself in slow luminous threads. It was beautiful in the way that deep places were beautiful, the beauty of a thing that had nothing to prove. She sat across from him on a chair made of driftwood and something that might have been coral, and she looked at him with eyes that were the precise color of the deep ocean trench where light stopped being light and became something else. Not dark. Past dark. The color of absolute depth. "The seal broke 6 days ago," she said. "I moved my ships here within 4 hours. "Why?" he asked. "Because the last time Aldrath existed, he burned the coast of what is now Thalindra 12 times in 2 years, she said. "I watched it happen. I was less powerful then." Something crossed her face, not anger, something colder and more total. "I had people I was responsible for." "I'm sorry," he said. The words landed in the room with an unexpected weight. He could see her recalibrate around them, the slight adjustment of her posture, the fractional narrowing of those extraordinary eyes. He got the impression that apologies were not something this conversation had been mapped to include. "You weren't there," she said carefully. "Part of me was," he said. "The part that burned your coast. That's not nothing." He held her gaze. "I can't give you those 12 burnings back. But I can be honest with you about what I am and what I'm not, and what I want, and let you decide what that's worth." She was quiet for a long time. The ship moved, very slightly, in the rhythm of the water that was its home. Through the stone walls he could hear the sea, not muffled, present, as though the walls were translucent to sound rather than solid against it. "The other kingdoms have been moving since the seal broke," she said finally. "Solmir took you in." Seraphine assessed the situation and made a tactical decision, he said. Which is her nature? She's a general. And you? What were you to her? An unknown quantity, he said. Still am, I think. She's still running the assessment. Thalindra Vel made a sound that was not quite a laugh but carried some of the same information. A general's way of making allies, she said. Calculate the utility. She's not entirely wrong to do it, he said. I am genuinely useful. He paused. But I don't want to be a weapon for Samra's empire. I want to understand what this world needs and try to provide it. He looked at his hands, the faint luminous quality, the scarred knuckles. I know that sounds convenient to say. It does, she agreed, without softness. I can't prove it in words, he said. It's the kind of thing that only demonstrates itself over time. He looked up at her. What I can tell you is that I've been in this world for 6 days and I've read every historical account I could find of the original Aldrath's coastal campaigns, and what I found was that they were not strategic. They weren't punitive. They weren't even particularly rational. He held her gaze. He was bored, wasn't he? Toward the end. Silence. Yes, she said, and the word cost her something. He could hear it, a small wound reopened, the kind that stays tender past any reasonable expectation. Yes. He was. I'm not bored, Izuku said. I have never in my life been bored. I have the opposite problem. He said it simply, without emphasis, and it landed the way simple things landed, without ceremony and with weight. Everything interests me. Every problem, every person, everything that's broken and needs fixing. That's not a power. It's how I'm made. Was how I was made, before all of this, and the before didn't stop being true. Thalindra Vel looked at him with those deep ocean eyes and he had the feeling of being read in a way that went past surface assessment, past even the acute reading that Seraphine did. Something older. The way the sea read coastlines, slowly, thoroughly, and without mercy. How did you die? She asked. The question came from nowhere and was somehow perfectly positioned. He told her. All of it, the convenience store, the notebook, the kid with the ball, the truck, the sound of brakes that didn't catch. He told her about waking up in the crater. He told her about the scarred knuckles and where they came from, which took longer, because explaining All Might and One for All and what it had meant to a quirkless child to be told he could be a hero required context she didn't have, but she listened with complete attention, asking no questions, just listening. When he was done, she was still for a long moment. You broke your body to earn something, she said. Repeatedly. Deliberately. Yes. And then you were killed preventing the death of a child who was not yours, not known to you, not owed anything by you. Yes. She stood up, moving to the curved stone wall, and pressed one hand flat against it. The water in the stone brightened faintly around her palm. The original Aldrath, she said, in the last years before the sealing, was asked by a harbor city why he had burned their port. They'd paid tribute. They'd been loyal. They hadn't crossed him in any way. She was quiet for a moment. He told them he had wanted to see what it looked like. Izuku said nothing. You are not the same, she said. It wasn't concession. It was the sound of a conclusion reached through rigorous process. The power is the same. The entity is not. No, he agreed. She turned from the wall. What do you want from Thalindra? Same thing I want from everyone, he said. I want you to help me understand what's actually wrong with this world, because everyone I've spoken to is managing the symptoms and nobody seems to be looking at the cause. He paused. And I'd rather Thalindra be part of the conversation than outside it. The conversation, she said, a slight edge on the word. Yes. You're building something, she said. I think I have to, he said. The covenant is cracking. Not because of me, it was cracking before the seal broke. I'm just the thing everyone's pointing at because it's easier to blame the obvious variable than to look at the structural problems. He leaned forward. The covenant needs to become something real. Not a deterrent maintained by fear of what I might do. An actual collaborative structure with actual shared interests. He paused. That only works if the most powerful voice in it isn't mine. Valindra Vel had gone very still. You want me to lead it, she said. I want you in the room, he said. What you do from there is your choice. He held her gaze. But you've watched every political structure on this continent get built and fail for 300 years. That's not nothing. That's expertise. The silence that followed was long and had a different quality from any of the silences before it. Not the calculating silence of Corvith, not the assessing silence of Seraphine. This was the silence of someone encountering something they had stopped expecting to encounter, surprise, at that depth, and at that age. I've been watching, she said, because I stopped believing any of it would last. And now? She looked at him with those impossible eyes and he held it without flinching, because she deserved to look, because she had 300 years of justified skepticism behind her gaze and he wasn't going to ask her to set it aside cheaply. Now, she said finally, is less clear. He stayed the night. Not because anything required it, but because she kept talking and he kept listening, and the conversation deepened through the ship's evening and into what passed for night on an anchored vessel, the watch bells, the distant sound of the crew, the sea doing its continuous patient work against the hull. She told him about the continent's original geography, not the current political map but the one underneath it, the physical and spiritual landscape that had existed before the current kingdoms claimed their borders. Rivers that used to connect what were now hostile territories. Trade routes that crossed what were now militarized frontiers. Ancient agreements between peoples that the Covenant had papered over rather than honored. She told him about the Void Gate. Not the Covenant's version, the sanitized version that called it a sealed dimensional fracture. The real version. What had actually come through? What it had taken to push it back? What had been left behind, in the deep places of the world, by the things that had crossed over before the gate was closed? He listened to all of it with the focused stillness he brought to everything that mattered. She told him about Cassiel, which he hadn't expected. You know him, he said. I've seen him, she said. Twice. He doesn't come to the coast, he avoids water, always has, which tells you something about what he is now versus what he was. But there was a summit, 300 years ago, the gathering of Vale, all the major powers, a genuine attempt at a new covenant structure. He was there. Not officially. He was present. She paused. I recognized what he was. An entity that has kept itself alive past its natural span. The methods leave marks. What kind of marks? The kind that means whatever comes out the other end isn't quite the same thing that went in, she said. Something is worn down. Not the intelligence. Not the will. The capacity for the unexpected. For being wrong. He's been certain for 10,000 years. She looked at him steadily. That's more dangerous than power. He sat with that. It rang true against the fragments in his inherited awareness, the sense of Cassiel as an outline of a person whose edges had been fixed in place by time. He's been engineering this, Izuku said. Not just waiting. Actively moving pieces. Yes, she said. The Covenant has been weakening for 30 years. Not from natural political pressure. From deliberate internal erosion. Someone has been feeding the fractures, supplying certain parties' grievances, ensuring certain negotiations fail, keeping the distrust between kingdoms precisely calibrated to prevent any genuine alliance. Because a genuine alliance between kingdoms doesn't need Aldrath, Izuku said. But a world in crisis, a world fracturing, a world on the brink of collapse, needs a god, she said. And what kind of god it gets depends on what it needs him to be. The ship was quiet around them. He could hear the water through the walls. He wants me to be the old one, Izuku said. He wants the world to force you to be, she said. That's more elegant. If the world's survival requires a tyrant, the tyrant doesn't have to choose to be one. He just has to be pragmatic. Izuku thought about Cassiel waiting 10,000 years with a single fixed idea. He thought about the 4 assassins in his room, the sub-sigil on the hilt. He thought about the Covenant's fault lines being fed rather than growing naturally. He's underestimated something, he said. What? That I care about the process, he said. Not just the outcome. A tyrant fixes things by imposing solutions. That works short-term and creates worse problems in the second generation. He looked at her. I want to build something that doesn't need me to hold it together. Felindra Vel regarded him for a long time. That, she said slowly, is either the most sophisticated political strategy I've encountered in 3 centuries, or you genuinely mean it. Both can be true, he said. Yes, she said, and something in her expression changed, not warming, exactly, because warmth was a small word for what was happening, but shifting towards something that had been closed for a long time and was considering opening. Yes, they can. Morning found them on the ship's prow, watching the sun come up over the Kelvin Sea. He'd been awake for it, he was reliably an early riser, the habit so deep it had apparently survived death and reincarnation, and she had simply been there when he came up, standing at the rail, because she didn't sleep the way humans slept and mornings on the ocean were clearly her particular ritual. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. I'll move the ships, she said, when the sun was fully up. I didn't ask you to, he said. I know. She was still looking at the water. I'm choosing to. A pause. The withdrawal of the blockade will be read by every court in Veltharion. Felindra has never retreated without a fight. It's not retreat, he said. It's a position change. The distinction matters to you. It matters to you, he said. I'm just naming it accurately. She turned to look at him then, fully, and he met it, and he thought, not for the first time, that the specific quality of how she looked at things was something that could teach you about looking. She had 300 years of watching things be less than they claimed and more than they seemed, and she brought all of it to a glance. What are you? She asked, and it was entirely different from any other version of that question he'd been asked, less about category and more about texture. More personal. I'm still finding out, he said honestly. She made that sound again, the not quite laugh. It was closer this time. Come back, she said. When things develop. I want to be in the room you're building. You will be, he said. He stepped off the prow onto the water and began the walk back to shore. Behind him he heard orders given in the carrying, projected voice she used, crisp, unambiguous, the voice of someone who had been issuing commands for 3 centuries and knew what made them stick. When he looked back from 100 yards out, the ships were beginning to move. All 3, coming about in the slow, purposeful arc of large vessels managed by expert hands, their sails catching the morning wind as they turned. Not fleeing. Moving with deliberate intent, the way powerful things moved when they chose direction rather than reacted to pressure. He watched until they were fully turned, then faced the shore. The walk back took the same 40 minutes. He spent the first half thinking about Cassiel and the second half thinking about the Void Gate's leftovers that Felindra had mentioned, things left behind in the deep places, which she described with a precision that suggested she knew exactly where they were and had been keeping watch on them for a very long time. That was a conversation they'd need to have again. He came off the water at the base of the cliff he'd descended the previous morning, walked up the cliff path with his boots still wet and the crow's bloom from yesterday wilted and tucked uselessly in his belt, and found the road. The road back to Orvain was long and the afternoon was clear, and the third village, the one he hadn't stopped at going out, had a market running by the time he passed through it. He stopped at a bread stall because the smell was extraordinary and he had been on a ship and then the ocean for most of a day and was, as remained apparently true of incarnate gods, hungry. The stall-keeper was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who looked at Izuku with the particular stillness of someone in mid-transaction with their own fear. Izuku pointed at the round dark loaf behind the man's shoulder. How much? For you. How much does it normally cost? Izuku said. A beat. 2 coppers. Izuku produced 2 coppers from the small coin pouch Seraphine's quartermaster had given him, placed them on the counter, took the bread. The man stared at the coppers. Thank you, Izuku said, and kept walking. He ate the bread and thought about Cassiel and the Void Gate and the 7 kingdoms and the shape of what needed to be built, and by the time he finished the bread he had the rough architecture of several things he needed to do in the next month, and by the time Orvain's towers came into view on the horizon he'd refined it enough to start explaining to Seraphine. She was at the gate when he arrived at dusk, which he hadn't expected. Not waiting, she was in conversation with one of her generals, head bent over a dispatch, fully engaged. But she was at the gate at the hour when he arrived, which was information, and he filed it in the same place he filed everything else about her. She finished with the general first, folded the dispatch with the efficient finality of someone closing a topic. Then she looked at him, at his still damp boots, at the dead flower in his belt, at whatever was visible in his face from the last day and a half. The ships moved, she said. Yes. I have 17 separate reports from observers between here and the coast confirming it. A pause. My council spent the morning either celebrating or panicking, depending on their individual risk tolerance. Which did you do? He asked. Neither, she said. I waited. She turned back toward the palace, and he fell into step beside her in the natural way that had developed over the last week, a walking pace that matched, the space between them something that had settled into its own kind of familiar. She agreed to the table. She said she wants to be in the room, he said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Thalindra Vel hasn't been in a room with another power voluntarily since the gathering of Vale. She glanced at him sidelong. What did you say to her? I told her the truth, he said. Which truth? All of it, he said. The truck. The notebook. The kid with the ball. He paused. She's been watching kingdoms lie to each other for 300 years. Honesty as a strategy is one she hasn't had to account for. Seraphine walked for a moment without speaking, and he let her process it the way she processed things, thoroughly, without rushing, making sure of it before acknowledging it. You're not building an alliance, she said. No, he agreed. You're building something that doesn't have a name yet. It'll have a name eventually, he said. Names come after structure. He looked at the city around them, the evening Orvain with its market stalls closing and its temple bells beginning the dusk count. Vermount's envoy. What did he say, specifically? She produced the dispatch from the fold of her coat. She'd been carrying it since the gate, he realized, probably for exactly this moment. She handed it to him without looking. He read it as they walked. The envoy's message was 12 lines. The word abomination appeared in line 1, as advertised, but so did something more interesting in line 7, a reference to the Forge King Thranos' personal theological position on what the return of Aldrath meant, which was specifically that it was a direct challenge to Vermount's claim of divine right of Forge, some ancient compact between the volcano deity and the kingdom's founding line. It's not political for him, Izuku said. No, Seraphine confirmed. For Thranos it's religious. The Forge God and Aldrath had a history, the original one. She paused. Thranos believes he has a mandate to challenge you. That's going to go badly for him, Izuku said, without particular drama. Yes, she said. The question is whether badly means diplomatically or physically. He handed the dispatch back. I want to see Vermount before he brings it to me, he said. On my terms, not his. You've been back 6 minutes, she said. The day after tomorrow, he said. I need tomorrow for the Cassiel information. He glanced at her. Nyx will have something from Dravatha's archives in 2 weeks. But I have enough to brief the council now. Seraphine stopped walking. He stopped with her. They were in the middle of the palace courtyard, the fountain in the center cycling its water in the last evening light, guards at perimeter positions, the business of the palace winding down around them. She looked at him with those gray eyes doing the thing they did, the flat assessment that was also, he'd begun to understand, something more personal underneath it. You went to the ocean alone, she said. You walked to an ancient sea spirit's worship and you spent a day and a half convincing her that the world is worth participating in, and you're back at dusk buying bread from a market stall and already planning the next 3 moves. A beat. Are you well? He blinked. He hadn't expected it. Of everything she could have said, the direct personal question was the one he hadn't modeled. Yes, he said, and then, because she deserved accuracy, better than I expected to be. The ocean is, there's something about it. He paused, looking for words that fit. It's old enough that talking to it feels honest. Nothing to prove in either direction. It's how I feel about a certain library, she said, with the dry precision that was her version of humor. He laughed. She didn't, quite, but the corner of her mouth moved in that specific way it moved when something landed correctly. Tomorrow, she said, resuming toward the palace. You brief the council on Cassiel. Then we discuss Vermount. And dinner, he said. The kitchen said something about fish last night. The kitchen has been trying to impress you since you ate 3 servings of the inaugural welcome meal and told the head cook the spicing was interesting, she said. You've created a competition I want no part of. The spicing was interesting, he said. It was genuinely interesting. Everything is interesting to you, she said. Yes, he agreed. That's what I told Thalindra. She looked at him again, briefly, and this time whatever was underneath the assessment was closer to the surface, something careful and unresolved, not yet ready to be named, filed in the same drawer as things that were waiting for their time. Come on, then, she said. Before Brenneth starts another incident. They walked into the palace together, and the torches in the corridor caught the gold of her armor and the slight luminous quality of his skin, and the guard at the interior gate saluted them both in the same breath, which was itself a small new thing in the world. Outside, on the Kaelvan Sea, 3 warships sailed home. In Dravetha's lower districts, a man named Cassiel sat in a room with no windows and read the report from his 4 operatives and was quiet for a long time. In the palace of Orvain, the kitchen produced a fish dinner that was remarkable, and Izuku ate 2 servings of it and told the head cook the saffron was doing excellent work, and somewhere in the east wing a shadow dancer slept soundly in a room next to the library and kept one hand on a blade she hadn't needed to use in 3 days and wasn't sure anymore whether she was keeping it for reasons that were still professional. The world held its shape for one more night. Tomorrow, it would start changing again. Chapter 4, Fire, Forge, and the Price of Pride. The council briefing on Cassiel lasted 2 hours and ended with Dravain sitting very still in his chair with the expression of a man whose professional worst-case scenarios had just been upgraded. Izuku kept it clean. No theater, no dramatic framing, he laid out what he knew in the sequence he'd learned it. Nyx's intelligence on the Sub-Sigil faction. Thalindra Vel's account of the gathering of Vale. The structural pattern of deliberate covenant erosion over 30 years. The specific theological detail that an entity maintaining itself past natural lifespan left marks, the kind that narrowed rather than expanded. He drew the Cassiel outline in facts and let the council do their own geometry. Brenneth, predictably, suggested military action. Against what? Seraphine said, before Izuku could respond. We have a name and a location and a pattern of behavior. We don't have evidence of a specific crime that any existing covenant law addresses. She looked at Dravain. Does the covenant have provisions for an entity that survived past natural span? Dravain made a sound like a man swallowing something uncomfortable. Theoretically, Clause 19 covers entities that distort the natural order through unnatural continuation. He paused. It's never been invoked. Because Cassiel has never been acknowledged, Izuku said. He stayed invisible. The faction in Draveth, the covenant erosion, it's all deniable. Nothing traces back cleanly. He looked around the table. Which means the play is to make him visible. Not to expose him legally. To make the other kingdoms aware that the instability they've been experiencing has a source, and the source is manageable. How? Brenneth asked, with the tone of a man who had a deep ideological commitment to problems being solved through force. By building something he can't quietly undermine, Izuku said. A table with Thilindra, Solmir, and ideally 2 or 3 more that he doesn't control the approach to. He looked at Seraphine. Which is why Vermount matters. Thranos is volatile but he's not corrupt. He genuinely believes what he believes, which makes him harder to manipulate than someone who's just doing politics. Seraphine's expression shifted in the specific way it shifted when she'd already calculated something and was waiting to see if someone else arrived at the same place. You want Thranos at the table, she said. I want Thranos' kingdom at the table, he said. Thranos himself is a separate problem. He'll send a war host, she said. When you enter Vermount, he'll read it as aggression. Then I won't enter Vermount, Izuku said. I'll walk up to the front and knock. Vermount was 3 days east and 2 days into the mountain range that everyone in Solmir called the Greymaw, which was accurate. The mountains were grey and enormous and had the particular unwelcoming quality of terrain that had decided a very long time ago it was not interested in human comfort. The road into them was a genuine road for the first day and then became a suggestion and then became a memory. He went alone. This had been a negotiation with Seraphine that lasted longer than the council briefing. She had argued practically, the terrain, the political optics, the military risk if Thranos moved quickly and Izuku needed backup that was 3 days of hard riding away. He'd listened to all of it carefully, which she'd noticed, because she'd been watching him learn that listening was its own kind of argument. Then he'd told her that bringing Samra's army to Vermount's door was exactly the framing Thranos would use to mobilize his forge hosts, and the thing he was trying to prevent was a war, not win one. She'd been quiet for a moment. Take a horse at least, she'd said. He'd taken the horse. It was a good horse, a broad-chested dark bay that the stable master had described as calm, which turned out to mean it would tolerate things that would have caused any sensible horse to express serious objections. When he'd levitated slightly off the saddle on the first afternoon to get a better look at the mountain ridge, the horse had simply waited, ears forward with the equine equivalent of polite patience. He called it something that wasn't quite a name, a mental notation, a frequency, the way you might distinguish one particular piece of music from another. The horse seemed to accept this arrangement. The mountains were extraordinary. He gave himself permission to register that fully rather than processing it purely as tactical geography. The stone was old and layered in ways that visible time, you could read centuries in the strata, whole eras stacked on each other, the world's autobiography written in compression and heat. The air at elevation was cold and sharp and tasted of iron and pine and something underneath both, something mineral and volcanic that grew stronger as he moved east. On the second day in the Greymaw, he encountered the first patrol. 8 soldiers, Vermount armored, heavy iron plate with the volcanic sigil of the forge god burned into the breastplates, faces obscured behind helmets designed to evoke something molten and partially fixed. Good fighters by their posture. The kind of discipline that came from drilling in terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. Their sergeant had her hand on her weapon before the horse fully stopped. Declare yourself, she said. Izuku, he said. I'm here to speak with Forge King Thranos. A silence. The patrol had gone very still in the way that happened when the variable in front of you refused to behave according to any available category. The entity, the sergeant said flatly, which told him word had traveled faster than he'd ridden. If that's what you're calling me, he said. She looked at him for a long, assessing moment. He could see her working through the options, turn him back, which was likely to produce an outcome she had no appetite for, attempt to detain him, same problem, or comply with the basic logic of the situation, which was that he was requesting an audience through legitimate channels. Wait here, she said. She sent a rider ahead at speed. Then she looked at him with the directness of a soldier who had decided that professional courtesy applied to all situations until they became untenable. It's 2 hours to the city gates. Thank you, he said. She blinked. The blink of someone who had not been thanked in that particular context before. They rode the 2 hours in a formation that was nominally an escort and functionally an honor guard that wasn't entirely sure it wanted to be, and Izuku occupied the time watching the mountains and thinking about Thranos' theological position and how to meet it honestly. Vermount City did not have an official name, which he found out later was deliberate. It was called Vermount because Vermount was what it was, not a name imposed on a place but a description of it. Built into and around and partially inside an active volcanic caldera, it was the most structurally audacious thing he'd seen in this world, which was saying something after the floating towers of Orwin on the horizon maps. The city grew out of the volcanic rock like it had been pulled from it, black stone buildings that incorporated natural formations, foundries that vented through channels carved into the caldera walls, the constant low vibration of forges running at industrial scale creating a subsonic hum that he felt in his molars. The air smelled of sulfur and hot metal and sweat and the specific acrid sharpness of magic being used at industrial intensity. Every surface had a pragmatic quality, nothing decorative that wasn't also functional, no wasted material, no architectural vanity. It was a city that meant every inch of itself. He liked it immediately. The gates were massive and operational rather than ceremonial, thick iron layered over volcanic stone, with channels running through the frame that glowed orange at the seams. They were open when the patrol brought him through, and the street inside had cleared in the particular way that streets cleared for things that warranted clearing. Not panicked, not hostile. Deliberate. The citizens of Vermount watched from doorways and upper windows with the frank, unsentimental assessment of a population that had been living next to an active volcano for generations and had developed a high threshold for ambient danger. He was brought to the Hall of the Forge, which was exactly what it sounded like, a vast chamber at the caldera's heart where the volcanic heat was a physical presence, the walls sweating with it, the ceiling so high it disappeared into a haze of heat distortion. At the far end, on a throne that was not ceremonial but was undeniably a throne, carved from a single piece of cooled lava stone, rough and uncompromising, sat Thranos, Forge King of Vermount. He was enormous. Not supernaturally so, but at the absolute upper edge of what biology could be convinced to produce, 7 feet of layered muscle and old battle damage, skin the deep brown of someone who had spent decades in forge heat, hands that looked capable of bending iron without tools. His eyes were amber, almost orange, and they tracked Izuku with the particular quality of someone who had decided something before this meeting began. On his right stood his war council. On his left, a priesthood of some kind, robes in volcanic colors, eyes cast down, the specific posture of people standing very close to something they considered sacred and terrible. In the front row of the forge priests, a young woman with the same amber eyes as Thranos but a completely different face, sharper, more mobile, the expression of someone who was thinking faster than the room around her and finding it frustrating. Thranos looked at Izuku for a long moment, and Izuku looked back, and the heat of the chamber sat between them like a third presence. "You walked into my city," Thranos said. His voice was what you'd expect, deep, carrying, calibrated for a room this size without effort. "You left the gate open," Izuku said. A sound in the room, not laughter, something more careful than that. The young woman's mouth moved in something that was approximately a smile before she suppressed it. Thranos leaned forward. "The Forge God's compact does not recognize your claim," he said. "The covenant of divine right under which this kingdom operates, I'm not claiming anything," Izuku said. "I came to talk." Was established at the continent's founding, before the covenant, before the shattered crowns, before, Thranos stopped. "What?" "I'm not here to claim anything," Izuku said. "I don't want Vermount's allegiance. I don't need your Forge God's acknowledgement. I'm here because you're one of 7 powers on this continent and the others are already talking to each other, and leaving you out of that conversation isn't useful for anyone, including you." Thranos stared at him with those amber eyes. "That's not what anyone expected you to say," the young woman said, from the front row. Thranos shot her a look. She received it with the calm of someone who had been receiving that look for years and had stopped being deterred by it. "Yold," Thranos said, "a warning and a name." "It's accurate, father," she said. It doesn't matter what he says, Thranos said, turning back to Izuku, and here the theological layer surfaced fully, the voice shifting from political cadence to the flatter, more absolute tone of genuine belief. The Forge God's compact is explicit. An apex entity that existed before the compact is a challenge to it. Your presence is a theological fact regardless of your stated intentions. He rose from the throne, which made the room adjust the way rooms adjusted when very large things moved. The Forge God's champion must stand against you. That is the compact. That is what I am. Izuku looked at him. He thought about Seraphine's warning, he'll read it as aggression. He thought about what Thalindra had said about certainty, 10,000 years certain was more dangerous than power. He thought about Thranos's amber eyes and the complete structural conviction in them, the absolute non-negotiable quality of a man who believed, genuinely, that this moment had been written into the world's design before he was born. He couldn't talk Thranos out of what Thranos was. Some convictions didn't have a conversational solution. All right, he said. The room went very still. If the compact requires it, Izuku said, then let's not waste each other's time. He looked at Thranos directly. But outside. Not in here. He looked at the walls, the forges, the city pressed close around the caldera. Too many people. They went to the caldera's outer rim, where the volcanic rock formed a natural platform above the city, wide enough and far enough from inhabited structures that it was the correct venue for what was about to happen. The war council came, and the forge priests, and apparently most of the city's population decided that the view from the lower levels was adequate because by the time they reached the rim the windows and rooftops below were full. Yold was there too, standing apart from both groups, watching with those quick amber eyes. Thranos shed the outer elements of his armor, the heaviest plating, the ceremonial pieces, and what remained was still formidable. He had a weapon, a forge hammer that was also not ceremonial, its head the size of a small anvil, the shaft wrapped in something that was glowing at intervals with channeled heat magic. He held it with the ease of someone who had been using it for decades. He was genuinely powerful. Izuku registered that with interest rather than concern. The Forge God's compact wasn't ceremonial either, there was something real in how Thranos held himself, a channeled quality, something that came through the kingdom's deep geological connection. He was a conduit for something ancient and willing. I want to be clear, Izuku said, standing 10 yards away, that I'm not here to kill you. I know, Thranos said. But the compact doesn't require your death. It requires your acknowledgement of its precedence. He raised the hammer. Stand down, declare the Forge God's primacy in Vermount, and this ends. I can acknowledge that the Forge God has primacy in Vermount, Izuku said. That seems geographically reasonable. He paused. But I can't declare it in the terms the compact requires, because those terms include my permanent subordination, and that's not honest. Thranos moved. He was fast, genuinely, impressively fast for someone his size, the hammer coming in with a trajectory that incorporated centuries of forge-honed technique, the channeled heat magic igniting into a wave of volcanic force that preceded the physical strike. The platform shook with the impact of his charge. Izuku stepped to the side. Not dramatically, just a small, economical step, a rotation of his weight, the hammer passing close enough that the heat wave hit him fully. He felt it, the same way he'd felt the crossbow bolts, impact, pressure, the sensation of significant force making contact with the thing that existed just in front of his skin. He caught the hammer's head with one hand. Not gripping it, receiving it, the way you received a thrown object when you understood its trajectory and mass. The volcanic channeling discharged into him with a sound like a bell struck by something far heavier than physics recommended, and the platform cracked in a radial pattern from his feet, and both of them stood still for a moment in the aftermath. Thranos looked at the hammer. At his hand. At Izuku. Izuku let go, stepped back, kept his hands open. I felt that, he said. For what it's worth. Thranos yanked the hammer back and came again. 3 more strikes, each one serious, each one incorporating the full weight of whatever channeled power he was drawing on. The platform took significant damage. The third strike produced a shockwave that shook the city below. He heard it, the distant sound of things falling off shelves, and felt bad about it. The forge priests were reciting something in cadenced unison that was either protective prayer or a more specific invocation. None of it moved him. He didn't counterstrike. He didn't push Thranos back. He absorbed, deflected, stepped, received, the posture of someone who was waiting for something to exhaust itself rather than meeting force with force, which was a deliberate choice rather than a limitation. And after the fourth pass, Thranos stopped, breathing hard, and looked at him with amber eyes that had acquired a new quality. Not defeat. Something more complicated. "You're not fighting," Thranos said. "No," Izuku agreed. "Why?" "Because I can end this in one move and I don't want to end it that way," Izuku said. "I want you alive and thinking, not unconscious and angry. You're more useful to the conversation that way." He paused. "And because you genuinely believe what you're doing. That deserves to be taken seriously even if it's not going to work." Thranos stared at him. From somewhere below, a single voice called something, young, carrying. He thought it was one of the children from the windows. Thranos turned toward the sound and then back. His jaw was set, his grip on the hammer still solid, the man's whole structure radiating the specific tension of someone whose foundational framework was straining under new weight. "The Forge God," he started. "What does the Forge God actually want?" Izuku asked. "Not what the compact says. What does the entity itself, the one your bloodline has been in contact with for generations, actually want for this kingdom?" Thranos blinked. It was a small thing, a slight thing, but it was the first unguarded response he'd given. "The compact is a document," Izuku said. "Documents serve the time that wrote them." He heard himself using Seraphine's logic or something close to it, but it fit. The Forge God's compact was written 10,000 years ago as a protection against the old Aldrath. "I understand that." It made sense at the time. He looked at Thranos steadily. "Is this kingdom better served by a 300-year Cold War escalating into an active one, or by a table where Vermount's voice is as large as anyone's?" Silence on the platform. The Forge priests had stopped their incantation. The War Council was very still. Below, the city was quiet in the attentive way of crowds that know something important is happening. Thranos lowered the hammer. Slowly. The channeled heat in it faded degree by degree as he released the draw, the glow at the seams dimming from orange to amber to the dull red of cooling iron. He looked at Izuku with those amber eyes for a long time. "You truly don't want the throne," he said. "I don't," Izuku said. "Why not?" And it was a genuine question, the first one from Thranos without any theological framework around it, just a man asking another man something he actually wanted to understand. "Because thrones require the person on them to make the world small enough to manage from a single position," Izuku said. "That's not what I'm built for." He glanced at the hammer. "And because I've seen enough of this world to know that what it actually needs isn't a ruler. It's a structure that doesn't collapse when the people inside it do." Thranos was quiet. Then, from the side, a sound, a low, grinding crack from the platform's edge where the most damage had accumulated from the fourth strike's shockwave. They both heard it. Thranos moved first, turning toward his war council, and Izuku was already reading the structural problem, a section of the rim, weakened by the accumulated hammering, giving way along a natural fissure in the volcanic rock, roughly 40 feet of platform edge beginning to slide toward the city below. 3 forge priests were standing on it. Thranos lunged toward them, which was the right instinct and approximately 4 seconds too slow. Izuku was there in one movement, the kind of movement that was essentially teleportation relative to normal physical capacity. Between one breath and the next he was at the edge, one hand catching the nearest priest by the robe as the rock went, his other hand planted on the separating section, holding 40 tons of volcanic rock in place with the absolute physical refusal of something that had decided a thing was not going to happen. The grinding stopped. The section held. He guided the three priests back from the edge and then released the rock slowly, redistributing its weight back into the platform with the care of a surgeon rather than the force of something that could have simply crushed it flat. The fissure sealed imperfectly but adequately, a repair that would need proper work later, but that wouldn't kill anyone today. He straightened up. Thranos was standing 6 feet away, and every person on the platform was looking at the same thing, not at the repaired edge, but at him. The forge priests he'd caught were looking at him with the wide-eyed expression of people who had just undergone a rapid and complete theological reorientation. "You saved them," Thranos said. "Obviously," Izuku said. "You could have what?" Izuku said, without heat. "Let them fall to make a point." He looked at Thranos. "I told you. I'm not here to kill anyone." Thranos looked at him for a very long time. Then he drove the forge hammer into the platform at his feet, not in aggression but in the specific way you planted a weapon when you were done using it, the gesture of someone laying something down rather than throwing it away. The handle remained upright, vibrating faintly. "Tell me about this table," he said. They talked for 3 hours, which turned into 4. Yul joined them after the first hour, pulling a chair from somewhere with the confident informality of someone who had decided that the situation had exceeded the boundaries of observational distance and she was going to be in it properly. She asked better questions than most of the War Council had, sharp and specific, always pointed at the mechanical details of how the structure Izuku was describing would actually function rather than whether it was a good idea in theory. Thranos listened more than he spoke after the first hour, which Izuku read as progress. The Forge King was not a stupid man. He was fixed, deeply fixed, in a way that had made him simultaneously the strongest ruler in Vermount's history and its primary political limitation, a man whose certainty had served his kingdom well in every situation that required certainty, and was now sitting across from a situation that required something else entirely. He was adjusting to it the way very strong, very fixed things adjusted, slowly, visibly, with effort. Sometime in the 3rd hour Thranos sent for food, which arrived in the Vermount style, heavy, dense, meat-centered, seasoned with something volcanic that turned out to be the most interesting thing he'd eaten in the week he'd been in this world, including the saffron fish. He said so. Thranos looked at him sideways. "You're complimenting my kitchen." "The mineral seasoning," Izuku said. "Is that local?" "Caldera salt," Yul said, with the tone of someone used to the fact that visitors were always surprised by this. "From the upper vents. It has a different mineral composition than sea salt." She paused. "We can't export much of it. The process of collecting it is," she tilted her head, "specialized. People don't queue up to harvest salt from active volcanic vents," Izuku said. "Not twice," she said, and the not-quite smile appeared again fully this time. Thranos watched this exchange with the expression of someone trying to locate himself on a map that had been redrawn without notice. Later, when the food was done and the evening had settled into the cooler volcanic night, Thranos said something that Izuku hadn't predicted. "Aldrath killed my grandfather," he said. "Not directly. The Third Coastal Campaign. My grandfather's regiment was guarding the northern mountain pass when the dragon fire reached them." He was looking at the caldera, not at Izuku. "The Forge God's compact wasn't theoretical to my family. My grandfather's death is written into the origin story of why we fight you." Izuku held the weight of that. Didn't deflect it. Didn't apologize in the hollow way that would have made it about himself rather than about Thranos's grief. "Tell me about him," he said. "Your grandfather." Thranos turned to look at him. "What was his name?" Izuku asked. The silence lasted a long time. Not uncomfortable, the specific silence of someone being asked something they rarely talked about and finding, unexpectedly, that they wanted to. "Bran," Thranos said. "His name was Bran." Izuku listened. The trouble came before morning. He'd been given quarters in the Upper Forge District, a room of black stone and practical furnishings and a window that looked directly into the caldera's glow. He'd been awake an hour, thinking, when he heard the commotion in the corridor, boots, multiple sets, moving fast with purpose. He opened the door. Yold was in the corridor with two of the forge guard, her face carrying something that had happened recently and hadn't finished happening. She looked at him and he saw it clearly. She'd been crying, recently, and had stopped, and her jaw was set in the specific way of someone who had decided that grief was not a luxury the current moment offered. "My father," she said. His chest tightened. "When?" he asked. "An hour ago." Her voice was even. Controlled in a way that was costing her his heart. She looked at Izuku with those amber eyes, still her father's eyes in shape and color, and he saw in them the specific combination of loss and weight that descended on people who inherited things they hadn't been ready to receive. He was 63. He'd known his heart was weakening for a year. He didn't tell the council. A pause. He didn't tell me. Of all the ways this day had been prepared to end, this one had not been in any of his models. He stepped into the corridor. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it, and she heard that he meant it, and for a moment something in her face briefly became what it actually was, the face of someone who had just lost their father, before it reassembled into what it needed to be. "The War Council will convene in the morning," she said. "There will be a faction that reads tonight's compact challenge as failed, and the timing of his death as," she stopped, jaw tightening. "As validation of the compact's requirement. That Aldrath killed him. It will be louder than it should be," he said. "Because grief looks for causes." She looked at him. "I didn't," he said. "I want to be direct about that. What happened on the platform was his choice and his exertion, and I gave him as little of a fight as I could. His heart was already, I know," she said. "I know you didn't." She looked down the corridor for a moment and back. "That doesn't change what the faction will say." "No," he agreed. "Which means the next 12 hours matter." He looked at her steadily. "You're the Forge Queen now." The title landed on her and he watched her receive it, not collapsing under it but not pretending it was light. She stood up fractionally straighter, the way people did when a thing they'd been prepared for and dreading simultaneously became real. "I haven't been crowned," she said. "In Vermount, the crown doesn't make the monarch," he said. "I read your succession law on the road coming in." He paused. "The Forge Compact does. And the Forge Compact passes through blood." He met her eyes. "You're the Forge Queen. You're telling me to move before the War Council does," she said. "I'm telling you what's true," he said. "What you do with it is yours." She looked at him for a moment with something that moved between assessment and grief, and the third thing, the thing underneath both, something she was deciding about, quickly, because quickly was what the moment required. "The faction will claim you need to be expelled," she said. "That tonight proves, I'll stay," he said. "If you want me to. Or I'll leave now, and the departure will be public and clearly voluntary, and you can frame whatever you need to frame about tonight without my presence complicating it." He paused. "Either way, the invitation to the table stands." It was made to Vermount, not to any individual king. Yold was quiet for a moment. "Stay," she said. "Be at the council convening in the morning. Let them see you there by choice." She looked down the corridor again, toward the part of the Forge district that was beginning to wake with the sounds of a palace that had learned its king was dead. "I want them to see what actually happened tonight, not the version someone else is already building." "Then I'll be there," he said. She nodded, once, the kind of nod that was a decision finalized. She started down the corridor, then stopped. "He liked you," she said, without turning. "By the end." He didn't say it. But Bran wasn't a figure he talked about often. A pause. "He talked about Bran for 2 hours tonight." She left before he could respond. He stood in the corridor for a moment, in the orange ambient glow of the caldera, and thought about a man named Bran, and a Forge King who had carried grief as a theological framework for 63 years, and whether that kind of carrying was ever truly over or just transferred. He thought it was probably transferred. He hoped Yold got to set it down someday. The war council convening was exactly what she'd predicted and nothing it expected. Isekai'd walked in as Forge Queen with the crown in her hand, not on her head, which was the Vermount tradition, the crown placed only after the convening, not before, and she walked in with her jaw set and her father's amber eyes doing their quick, comprehensive read of every person in the room. The faction was there. For senior council members whose argument about the Knights' Compact challenge and its correlation to Thranos' death was delivered with the passionate efficiency of people who had been constructing it since the news broke. They were loud and they were not stupid and they had the emotional leverage of genuine grief amplified by political purpose. Izuku sat at the side of the room, not at the table, and watched. Isekai'd let them speak. Fully, completely, she let every argument run to its natural conclusion without interruption, which silenced the room more effectively than any counter-argument would have, because everyone in it understood that she was letting them hear themselves. Then she described what had happened on the platform. Step by step. Not the version the faction was building, but the one she had watched from the front row of the Forge priests. 3 priests at the edge. The rock giving way. One movement, and they were safe. She looked at Izuku. The room turned. He looked back at the council, and then at Isekai'd, and he said, "Your king asked me about the Forge God's true interests, not the Compact's stated terms. He asked it because he was a man who believed deeply, but he was also a man who understood the difference between the spirit of a thing and the letter of it." He paused. He was trying to reconcile those two things when he died. I think he was close. The room was quiet. The faction leader opened his mouth. Isekai'd placed the crown on her head. The room's attention completed its transfer, instantly and completely, the way authority moved when it was genuine, not grabbed but assumed, the natural shift of weight when something found its proper position. "Vermount is at the table," she said. "That is my first act as Forge Queen." The faction leader closed his mouth. He left Vermount in the afternoon, with the warm smell of caldera salt still in his clothes and a small package of it that Isekai'd had pressed into his hands at the gate with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who had decided sentiment was better expressed through practical gifts. The mountains were golden in the late sun as he rode out, the horse moving at the comfortable pace it had apparently decided was its preferred contribution to the situation. He was 2 hours into the Greymaw before he stopped and looked back. The city was visible from here, settled into its caldera like something grown rather than built, the glow of the forges visible even in daylight, smoke rising from the industrial vents in the steady patterns of a place that was always working. A place that meant every inch of itself. Bran, he thought, had probably died believing in something worth believing in. He hoped the world he was building would be worth the inheritance. He turned back to the road and rode east to west through the mountains, toward the coast, toward Orvain, toward whatever Seraphine had been managing in his absence with the particular forceful competence that was her version of worried, and toward the message he was certain Nyx had left with the librarian, and toward the shape of something that was beginning to have enough pieces that you could almost see what it was going to be. Almost. The mountain pass caught the last sun as he rode through it, and the sky beyond was that same bruised purple he'd woken up under, and somewhere in the vast, patient awareness at the back of his mind, something old turned over slowly like a tide coming in, and he rode on. Chapter 5, The Scholar and the Dragon. The message Nyx left with the librarian was a single line, written in Dravatha's shadow cipher that he could now read without effort: "She's already here." He found out who she was at breakfast. Seraphine was waiting for him in the dining hall when he arrived, 2 days after leaving Vermount, still carrying the smell of mountain pine and caldera salt. She had a cup of something dark and bitter that she drank without apparent pleasure, functional caffeine, he'd decided, rather than enjoyment, and a report she set on the table in front of him before he'd fully sat down. "Orwin's queen arrived yesterday," she said. "With a delegation of 9 arcane scholars and absolutely no military escort, which is either confidence or a statement." "Both," he said, reaching for the bread. "She requested an audience with you specifically." Seraphine paused. "Phrased as a research consultation." He stopped reaching for the bread. "A research consultation," he said. Her exact words, per my gate official, were, I would like to schedule time with the entity for academic purposes, pending confirmation that it is capable of sustained intellectual discourse. Seraphine delivered this with the flat precision of someone reading a sentence that offended them on multiple levels. The gate official wasn't sure whether to be insulted on your behalf or on Samura's. Izuku thought about this for a moment. Then he laughed, a full one, genuinely surprised out of him, the kind that happened when something was so specifically absurd that it bypassed any considered response and went straight to delight. Seraphine watched him laugh with an expression that was trying very hard to be disapproving and not quite getting there. I like her already, he said. You haven't met her yet. She called me an entity and questioned whether I could hold a conversation, he said. That's the most honest first contact anyone in this world has managed. He picked up the bread. Where is she? I put her in the East Reception Hall, Seraphine said. She immediately rearranged the furniture and has been there since yesterday evening with 3 of her scholars running what appears to be some kind of instrumentation. A pause. My chamberlain says they brought equipment. What kind of equipment? The kind that takes 4 people to carry and makes a sound like a very disappointed bell when it's operating. He ate the bread and thought about this with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that interested him very much. Queen Mira of Orwen was 26 years old, which made her the youngest ruler in Velfarion by a margin of roughly a decade, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been the smartest person in every room she'd ever entered and had stopped finding this satisfying sometime around age 14. She was not tall, not conventionally striking, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that were a warm amber brown behind a pair of wire-framed lenses that had the look of something modified beyond their original purpose, thicker in specific spots, with a faint arcane iridescence at the edges. She was looking at one of her instruments when he walked in. Not pretending to look at it, actually reading it, one hand making small adjustive movements to a dial, her other hand writing rapidly in a notebook without looking at the paper. The instrument itself was extraordinary. He stopped just inside the doorway to look at it properly. A brass framework, roughly the size of a wardrobe, with nested rotating rings marked in symbols he recognized as advanced arcane notation, not the kind on Dravain's wrists, more theoretical, more structural, the notations of someone working at the foundational level of how magic operated rather than how to use it. Inside the rings, something that looked like suspended light, not a flame, not a glow, but actual captured light, held in place, bending slightly toward where he was standing. 3 scholars flanked the instrument. One of them noticed him first, and said something quietly. Mira looked up. She looked at him for approximately 2 seconds, a rapid, comprehensive scan, the kind that read category, dimension, energy output, and variable quality simultaneously, and then she looked back at her notebook. You're reading higher than the baseline by a factor I'm going to need to recalibrate for, she said, writing without pause. Stand still for a moment. He stood still. The light inside the brass framework shifted noticeably toward him, the rings rotating in the gentle, autonomous way of something responding to a source. Interesting, she said, still writing. The resonance pattern is bilateral, old world signature and something more recent, layered. Like, she paused, wrote something, paused again. Like 2 keys cut for the same lock but at different times. That's accurate, he said. She looked up again. This time the 2-second scan extended, 3 seconds, 4. He had the impression of being read very quickly and very thoroughly, and the impression was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. Most forms of being studied had an objectifying quality. Hers felt more like being heard. You understand the notation on the framework, she said. Most of it, he said. The 3rd and 5th ring are using a derivation of Old Veilfairy arcane that shifted after the Covenant period. I can follow the intent but some of the specific term values have drifted. Mira stared at him. The notation is my own, she said. I developed it over 6 years. It's not published anywhere. Oh, he said. Then I'm reading the underlying structure rather than the notation. The symbols resolve to their logical functions if you look at what they're doing rather than what they say. He paused. Sorry, Is that useful or annoying? I genuinely can't tell. One of the scholars made a sound that could have been a cough. Mira set down her pen. She pulled a second chair from the wall. He noticed she'd rearranged the entire room with a very specific logic, everything positioned relative to the instrument's field radius, and set it across from hers with the decisive placement of someone who had decided to have a conversation. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him, removed her glasses, cleaned them on her sleeve in the automatic way of someone who did it constantly and didn't notice, and replaced them. You're not what I modeled, she said. What did you model? Something more. She moved her hand, a searching gesture, residual. The historical accounts of apex entities suggest a reduction in individual cognition as the power scales. A trade-off, basically, the higher the arcane ceiling, the more the specific personality erodes toward archetype. She looked at him steadily. You have a specific personality. I noticed, he said. It's theoretically impossible, she said, with the directness of someone stating a fact rather than complaining about it. The power signature you're putting out should be incompatible with the retention of whatever you are. The Izuku Midoriya element. Has it occurred to you, he said, that your model might be wrong? The silence had the specific quality of silence in rooms where an argument was being considered seriously rather than defensively. Obviously, she said. That's why I'm here. She picked up the pen again, not to write but as a thinking prop, turning it in her fingers. The Orwin position on your return has been contested. There's a faction that supports the Covenant's Clause 7 position. There's a faction that wants immediate alliance. I rejected both. Because both positions start from conclusions, she said. I don't start from conclusions. I start from questions. She looked at him over the top of her glasses with the particular expression of someone about to be more honest than politeness strictly required. My question is, what are you? Not politically. Not theologically. Structurally. What is actually happening in the space you occupy, and what does it mean for the physical laws that govern this world? He looked at her with the same complete attention he brought to everything, and she held it without the flinching or the recalibrating that most people did. She was accustomed to looking at things directly. I'll tell you everything I know, he said. Which is incomplete. But if you're running genuine investigation rather than confirmation, incomplete is where everything starts. Yes, she said. It is. She opened to a fresh page. Start from the beginning. They talked for 6 hours. Not a briefing, a genuine exchange, the kind that moved fast and doubled back and went sideways into adjacent territories and returned enriched. She asked questions that nobody else had asked, precise and structural, forcing him to articulate things he'd been operating on as intuition and examine whether the intuition held under the pressure of specificity. She asked about the bilateral signature, the old-world Aldrath component and the modern Izuku Midoriya component. How they interacted. Whether one suppressed the other or whether they ran simultaneously. Whether the Midoriya component had access to the Aldrath knowledge base or whether it was one way. He had to think about that one carefully. Both, he said finally. But the access isn't clean. The old knowledge comes up in structures rather than specifics. I understand things without knowing how I understand them. And the me part modifies how I use what I access. I don't think I could access it the same way if the me part was different. She wrote for 30 seconds without speaking. So the personality isn't incidental to the power, she said. It's load-bearing. He felt something shift in his understanding, like a piece that had been floating found its position. Yes, he said. I think that's right. She looked at him with an expression that was as close to excitement as her controlled baseline seemed to permit, a sharpening, a brightening, something behind the glasses that was moving quickly. That completely inverts the prevailing arcane theory on apex entity structure, she said. Every model assumes personality as residue, something that survives despite the power. If it's actually structural, she was writing again, if the specific cognitive and emotional framework of the individual is part of the engine rather than just a passenger, then you can't replicate it, he said. You can't take the power and put it somewhere else and get the same thing. The thing and the person are the same thing. She stopped writing. She looked at him over the glasses again. You're already doing the analysis, she said. I've had a week of being this and thinking about it, he said. What have you been doing? 6 years of preliminary research, she said, with the flat competitive energy of someone who had just been equaled in a race they expected to be alone in, and was deciding whether to be annoyed or pleased. It was, he decided, the most honest thing anyone had said to him in Beltharion. Seraphine found them at the 4th hour, appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone checking on a situation that was proceeding unusually, and registered the notebooks, the instruments, the scattered reference texts that Myra's scholars had apparently retrieved from somewhere, and Izuku fully engaged in what looked like a mutual interrogation. She looked at this for a moment. Then she brought food, which arrived with the kitchen's current dedicated effort, and set it on the side table without interrupting, and left. He caught the specific quality of her exit, not displeasure, something more specific. He filed it and stayed in the conversation. Mira asked, in the 5th hour, about the Void Gate. He told her what Thalindra had shared, the actual version, not the Covenant sanitized one. The things that had come through. The things left behind. She stopped writing. The things left behind, she said carefully. In the deep places. Yes. Are they related to? She stopped. She picked up one of the reference texts, flipped to a page with the speed of someone who knew exactly where every page in every book was, and held it out to him. It was a diagram. A structural map of something arcane, rendered in the theoretical notation she used, but underneath that an older script was the original, a Veilfairy term he parsed slowly. Void-seated anchors, he said. Dormant, she said. Theoretically. But dormant isn't inert. She looked at him. In the last 3 years, we've detected 7 of them activating. Not fully, they're not open gates. But they're responding to something. Building toward something. She paused. I thought it was natural, a cycle, an arcane tide. But if the Covenant erosion is deliberate, and Cassiel has been engineering instability for 30 years, he said. The anchors don't just respond to power, she said. They respond to the kind of atmospheric conditions you get when everything is fracturing simultaneously. Political instability, arcane instability, the breakdown of structured agreements between powers. He's not just waiting for the world to need a tyrant, Izuku said. The room had gone very quiet. The 3 scholars were looking at each other. He's preparing the world to need something much worse than a tyrant, Mira said. If the void-seated anchors activate fully, they open, Izuku said. The things that didn't come through 10,000 years ago get another chance. Mira closed the book. She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes steady behind the lenses, and he looked back, and between them was the specific silence of 2 people who have just arrived at the same terrible conclusion from different directions. How close? He asked. 7 activating, she said. Fully requires all 12. Based on the activation rate, she looked at her notes, 6 months. Maybe 8. And the Covenant's collapse accelerates it, he said. Yes. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the East Reception Hall, which was painted with some historical scene he hadn't paid attention to until now, a battle, old figures in old armor, a sky full of something that might have been dragons or might have been fire. Cassiel doesn't want me to be a tyrant, he said, not to Mira specifically, working it through aloud. He wants me to be the only thing standing between this world and what comes through the Void Gate. He wants to create a situation where the only solution is the old Aldrath, total power, total control, one being holding everything together by force because the alternative is catastrophic. He looked back at her. And he's been patient enough to engineer it over decades. He's been patient enough to engineer it over centuries, Mira said. The gathering of Vale, 300 years ago, the one that almost produced a genuine new covenant structure, fell apart in the final session over a territorial dispute between Vermount and Thylindra that by my research should never have escalated to session-breaking level. She held his gaze. Someone made it worse. He was there, Izuku said. Yes, she said. I believe he was. The attack came at night, which was when Cassio's operations preferred to work. But this one was different from the 4 in his bedroom, different in scale, different in method, different in the quality of what it brought. He felt it before it happened. The vast, patient awareness at the back of his mind shifted, not the gradual turn of a tide but something sharper, a sudden orientation, the way you oriented toward a sound in darkness. Something old recognizing something else old. He was in the corridor outside the library, returning from a late conversation with Nyx about the archive materials she'd sourced, when it happened. The quality of the air changed, a specific quality, the sweet wrong scent magnified to something industrial, and underneath it a deeper wrongness, something not chemical but structural, the arcane equivalent of a subsonic warning tone. He stopped walking. The corridor torches went out simultaneously. In the dark, something arrived. It came through the wall, not breaking through it, moving through it, which told him immediately what category of thing it was. An old-world construct, something assembled rather than born, powered by the kind of arcane fuel that shouldn't exist in quantities sufficient for this scale. It was roughly human-shaped but not human-sized, twice the height, the body a compressed architecture of shadow and hardened void residue, moving with the silent purposefulness of something given a single instruction and the means to carry it out. 2 of them. The second came through the ceiling. He stood in the corridor and looked at them. Cassio, he said, to the air. You're not here yourself, which means either you're not confident enough yet or you're not done with the setup. I'm going with the second one. He looked at the constructs. These are void residue based. The leftover things from the gate. You've been collecting them. A pause. For 10,000 years, you've been collecting them. The constructs moved. They were fast, faster than anything physical had a right to be, the speed of something that didn't have to negotiate with friction or momentum. The first reached him in a fraction of a second and hit the thing in front of his skin with a force that drove him backward 3 full steps, which was the first time anything in this world had moved him involuntarily. He registered that with interest. The second came from above, a downward strike with both compressed shadow limbs, and he caught it, not with his hands, with the actual substantial presence of his power expanding outward, a field that stopped the construct in its downward arc and held it. The construct fought the hold, and it fought hard, and the corridor shook with the effort on both sides. He was stronger. But not by as much as everything else in this world had suggested he should be. Void residue amplified, he said, partly to himself, pushing through the analysis even while the first construct came in again. You've been feeding them. Decades of deliberate arcane instability generating ambient void energy, and you've been directing it into these things. He stepped aside from the first construct's second pass, let it go through the wall behind him and come back. That's what the Covenant erosion was really for. Not just political chaos. Energy collection. The constructs regrouped. They communicated without sound, a structural resonance, the way things built from the same material communicated. Then they moved together, and that was qualitatively different. The combined force was not simply doubled, it was something more complex, something that operated on a different principle, the void residue components reinforcing each other in a pattern that read like a key. Not trying to kill him, he realized. Trying to reach the old Aldrath component. Trying to unlock something. He changed what he was doing completely. Where he'd been holding them at extension, he let them come. He stood still and let both constructs make full contact, the combined force hitting him like a geological event, the corridor around him simply ceasing to exist in a radius of 10 feet, stone and plaster and would reduce to component particles, the air pressure spike shattering every window in the east wing simultaneously. He stood in the wreckage of the corridor, dust settling, the constructs pulling back from the contact already dissolving at their edges, they'd spent a significant portion of their stored void energy in that combined strike and the return had been wrong, the thing they'd been trying to access not there in the form they were built to reach. That's interesting, he said quietly. You built them to reach Aldrath. But Aldrath and I are the same load. You can't get one without the other. The constructs were reforming, slower now, the dissolution at their edges spreading. He looked at them with the feeling of someone who had understood a problem and was now deciding how to resolve it. Not with rage, with the specific, focused quality of someone setting something right. He spoke in Old Veilfairy. Not the modern form, the original, the language that existed in the deep archive of the awareness at his back, the language that the first Aldrath had spoken when this world was younger. The words were not a command. They were closer to a statement of fact: what you are made of does not belong here, and it is time to return. The constructs stopped. The void residue in them responded to the language the way elements responded to their proper names, not with submission, but with recognition. Something in the fundamental structure of what they were made of remembering what it was and where it came from. They dissolved. Not violently, the compression releasing, the hardened void residue dispersing into ambient arcane material, the shadow components fading in the ordinary way of shadows when the thing casting them was gone. Where they'd been, the corridor air was slightly warmer, slightly brighter, the way rooms felt after something dark had been removed. He stood in the ruined section of corridor, stone dust settling on his shoulders, 3 torches worth of sconces around him reduced to their component metal. Behind him, from the direction of the library, running footsteps. Nyx arrived first. She'd been in the library when the windows went, and she'd come without the shadow cloth, in the plain dark clothing she wore underneath, which was the first time he'd seen her without the professional carapace, and she looked younger for it, her silver eyes scanning the corridor with the rapid assessment of someone arriving at a concluded event and reading backwards from the evidence. Mira arrived 30 seconds later, glasses askew, a notebook already open in her hand, ink on her fingers from writing mid-run. She looked at the dissolved corridor. She looked at him. She looked at the dispersal pattern on the floor where the void residue had gone. What were those? She said. Void-seeded constructs, he said. Cassiel's work. Fueled by 30 years of ambient void energy from deliberately maintained political instability. He looked at the dispersal pattern with her. The activation rate of your anchors is going to accelerate. He just spent a significant portion of what he'd collected. He'll recalibrate. Mira was already crouching over the dispersal pattern, writing. How hurt are you? Nyx asked, which was so direct and so stripped of professional framing that it landed differently from how it would have coming from anyone else. I moved 3 steps involuntarily, he said. First time. Her jaw tightened fractionally. That bothers you. It tells me something about his timeline, he said. Those constructs were built for a specific purpose and that purpose wasn't killing me. He's past the stage of trying to eliminate the problem. He met her eyes. He's moved to the stage of trying to control the outcome. Nyx was quiet for a moment, reading his face with those silver eyes. The archive materials, she said. I need to tell you something. He waited. The 300-year record in Dravatha's archive, she said. I told you Cassiel was at the gathering of Veil. But there's more. She looked at the dispersal pattern, at Mira still crouching over it, and made a decision about what to say in front of the Orwen Queen and said it anyway. He wasn't just there to disrupt the summit. He was there to find something. The archive records show he was looking for a specific vault, Dravatha's oldest vault, pre-covenant, pre-shattered crowns. They called it the Morning Archive. What's in it? He asked. I don't know, she said. The record cuts off. The archivist who kept it stopped writing mid-entry, which in Dravatha's methodology means they were interrupted, probably fatally. She held his gaze. Cassiel found it. 300 years ago. And whatever he found in it, it changed his approach, because before the gathering of Veil he was moving reactively, maintaining the erosion. After it, he started moving toward a specific end. The void anchor activation, Mira said, from the floor, without looking up. He's been working toward that specifically for 300 years. Based on what I've found, Nick said. Yes. Mira stood up. She looked at both of them with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, processing, recalculating, and arriving at something that sat at the intersection of professional investment and genuine personal alarm. The Morning Archive, she said. I know that name. There's a reference in Orwin's foundational texts, a vault that was sealed by the original compact signatories because it contained the methodology of the original Aldrath's final months. The things he was doing before he sealed himself away. She looked at Izuku. Not the burning. The other things. What he was preparing for. He was preparing to close the void gate, Izuku said. The fragment surfaced from the deep awareness, not a memory, a structural echo, the shape of an intention that had never been completed. He wasn't burning kingdoms because he was bored. He was clearing a field of fire. The corridor was very quiet. He was preparing for an incursion, Izuku said. The gate was going to open. Something was coming through, something big enough that he needed the entire continent cleared of anything that could be used against him. He stopped. The shape of it was enormous and cold and explained every historical atrocity in a single frame. He sealed himself before he finished, which means whatever methodology he developed was incomplete. That's what was in the Morning Archive. And Cassiel found it, Mira said. And has spent 300 years engineering the conditions to complete it, Nick said. Not to stop the incursion, Izuku said. No, Nick said. To control it. He stood in the ruined corridor and let the full shape of it settle. 10,000 years of a general waiting for his god to return. 300 years of active engineering once he found the methodology. The void anchors activating, the covenant fracturing, the political instability generating ambient void energy that fed the constructs designed to reach the old Aldrath component and unlock something. He wants to open the gate himself, Izuku said. On his terms. With enough control over the incursion to shape what comes through and how. He looked at his hands. And he needs me to do it. The old Aldrath's power is the only thing capable of operating at that scale. He doesn't want to kill me. He wants to use me. By making you the only alternative to catastrophe, Mira said. If the anchors activate and the gate opens without a controlled framework, everything that couldn't come through 10,000 years ago comes through at once, he said. And the only response that works is total power, total force, one being holding the line alone. He paused. Which changes me. Which turns the choice into the thing he wants. The three of them stood in the ruined corridor and sat with the weight of it. Then Mira said, I can slow the anchor activation. He looked at her. Not stop it, she said quickly. Not with current resources. But slow it. The activation responds to ambient arcane instability. If we can stabilize the political environment fast enough to reduce the void energy generation, we buy time. She was already writing in the notebook. 3 months, maybe 4. If the table you're building actually coalesces and holds. And if it doesn't coalesce? Nick said. Then 6 months becomes 4, Mira said. And 4 becomes less than that. Seraphine appeared at the end of the corridor, fully armored despite the late hour, which told him she'd been awake and the sound of the East Wing's windows all going at once had not been ambiguous. She looked at the destroyed section of corridor, at the three of them, at the dispersal pattern on the floor, and her face did the thing it did when she was rapidly recategorizing information. Brief me, she said. He looked at her. She looked back with those flat gray eyes that were afraid of him and said so honestly and had been since day one, and he thought about the shape of what was coming, 6 months, 4 months, the gate, the constructs, Cassiel's 10,000-year plan arriving at its final stage. He thought about a table with enough chairs. A structure that didn't need him to hold it together. He thought about Seraphine managing a 3-front war alone for 6 years, and Thalindra watching kingdoms fail for 3 centuries, and Yod receiving an inheritance before she was ready, and Nyx laying down her mask in increments beside a fountain, and Mira running toward the sound of arcane destruction with an open notebook. "Yes," he said to Seraphine. "We need to talk." He walked toward her and she turned to fall in step beside him, because that was what they did now. They moved in the same direction with the easy synchrony of people who had been learning each other's rhythms and had not yet named what that learning was. Behind him he heard Mira and Nyx, briefly, improbably, exchanging names with the cautious, genuine quality of people who had just been through something together and were beginning to revise their first impressions of each other. He filed that away in the column with the best things. The briefing with Seraphine lasted until dawn. Mira joined them halfway through, and Nyx sat in the window the way she preferred to sit, present without claiming space, and by the time the sun came up they had something that looked, in very rough architectural form, like a plan. Not a perfect plan. Several of its load-bearing elements depended on variables they couldn't fully control: Cassiel's timeline, the anchor activation rate, how quickly the remaining two kingdoms could be brought to the table. But it was structurally sound and they had all challenged each piece of it with the particular rigor of people who understood the cost of failure. He'd been awake for most of 2 days. He was, apparently, not especially vulnerable to fatigue in the conventional sense, but there was a quality to extended wakefulness that was familiar from his previous life, a narrowing, a slight reduction in the margin around thoughts. He noticed it and accounted for it. Seraphine had been awake the same length of time and showed it less, which he suspected was long practice. Mira had fallen asleep in her chair at some point in the 4th hour of the briefing with the absolute completeness of someone whose body had made a unilateral decision. One of her scholars had appeared at some point and covered her with a coat. Nyx was gone from the window when he looked, present one moment and not the next, which was how she moved, the absence as clean as the presence. Seraphine poured the last of the coffee equivalent into 2 cups, which had run cold, and held one out. He took it. They sat in the early morning light, the map on the table between them marked in 4 colors of ink, the weight of what was coming substantial and present. "Eleshra and Nokrath," he said. "Eleshra will take time," she said. "The Elven court doesn't move quickly and resents being rushed." A pause. Nokrath is different. The Death Mage Queen, Valeth, has been waiting for something like this. She's been managing the void-adjacent energy in her territory for decades. She knows more than anyone outside this room about what's happening. She's been dealing with the anchor activations herself, he said. "Probably," Seraphine said. "Alone, which is Nokratha's way." He drank the cold coffee. Thought about Valeth managing void-adjacent territory solo for decades with no one to tell and no structure to report to. "She should have been at a table 30 years ago," he said. "Yes," Seraphine said. "She should have." He looked at the map. At the table they were building, Solmir, Thalindra, Vermount, Orwyn. 4 chairs. 3 more needed. Cassiel's timeline running in the background like a counter. He thought about the constructs dissolving when he spoke Old Veiltheri. The void residue responding to its proper name. The idea that things remembered what they were when you called them correctly. Maybe that was true of people too. Maybe that was what the table was, a way of calling things by their proper names. Not covenant, not deterrence, not the managed balance of mutual threat. Something that was what it actually was. "What do you want to call it?" Seraphine asked. "The structure. When it's built." He thought about it. "Nothing yet," he said. "Myra's right, names come after structure." Seraphine looked at the map. "She's not what I expected," she said, and it was about Mira, and it was also not entirely about Mira. "She's exactly what she seems to be," he said. "Which is rare." Seraphine was quiet for a moment with the specific quality she had when something was present in her that she was deciding about. "You did something in that corridor that moved the world," she said. "The language you used. I heard it from the other end of the hallway and I didn't understand the words but I understood." She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at him. The gray eyes with the fear under them, the fear she was better at than most, the fear that had been there from the road on day one and had become something more complex and less distant over 11 days and hadn't resolved into anything that had a clean name yet. I understood that you knew what you were doing, she said. Not the power. You. That you chose that specific thing in that specific way because it was the right thing. She looked at the map. I've been in battle for 6 years and I know the difference between a commander who reacts and a commander who chooses. You're both, he said. I try to be, she said. You are, without trying. He looked at her profile in the morning light, the scar along her jaw, the dented pauldron, the crown she wasn't wearing because she rarely wore it and it sat on the corner of the table instead like a particularly heavy paperweight. I try, he said. I'm just faster at it than I look. She made a sound that was a small, genuine laugh, the first one he'd heard from her, not the near laugh, the actual thing, quiet and brief and immediately retired back behind her usual composure, but real. Go sleep, she said. We have a Leshra to think about tomorrow. And no Krath, he said. And no Krath, she agreed. He stood, and she stayed at the table with the map and the cold coffee and the morning coming in, and he walked to the door and stopped. Seraphine, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. For day one. The road. She held his gaze for a moment. You were sitting in my road, she said. I know, he said. She looked back at the map, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it moved when something landed correctly, and he went to sleep. Outside, the city of Orvain was waking to its 12th day of being the center of the world's attention, and somewhere in Dravatha's lower districts, in a room with no windows, Cassiel sat with the report of his construct's dissolution and was quiet for a long time, and then began writing, because he had been patient for 10,000 years and he was patient still, and the world had 6 months left of its current shape, possibly 4, and the God who had come back wrong was going to find out. That some things could not be changed by kindness or cleverness or the specific architecture of a boy who broke himself to earn the right to matter. He believed that completely. He had believed it for 10,000 years. That was, precisely, the problem.